In the quiet farmlands of western Montana, James Cooper was about to teach the Iron Wolves motorcycle gang a lesson about judging books by their covers. To them, he was just another aging farmer, an easy target for their expanding protection racket. What they didn't know was that for 20 years, Cooper had been the man who trained America's deadliest soldiers, teaching Special Forces operators how to turn the tables on superior numbers. As their chrome-plated Harleys roared up his dusty driveway that autumn morning, Cooper continued calmly sharpening his scythe, his weathered hands moving with the same precision he'd once used to teach Green Berets how to survive behind enemy lines. Their leader, a hulking man called Butcher, had already muscled his way through 3 counties. But he was about to learn why Cooper's former students, the elite of America's Special Forces, still spoke of their old instructor with a mixture of respect and fear. The Iron Wolves hadn't found another victim. They'd found a teacher, and class was about to begin. Greater than. The autumn sun had barely crested the eastern mountains when James Cooper began his daily routine. At 60 years old, his movements were deliberate but fluid as he moved through the pre-dawn darkness of his farmhouse. 20 years of military service, followed by 5 years of working the land, had ingrained in him a rhythm as natural as breathing. He pulled on well-worn work boots, their leather creased and comfortable, before stepping onto his front porch. The crisp Montana morning air carried the scent of pine and freshly cut hay. His border collie, Scout, emerged from his bed under the porch, stretching lazily before falling into step beside his master. Cooper's 200 acres spread out before him, golden wheat swaying in the gentle breeze. To anyone passing by, it looked like any other Montana farm, productive, well-maintained, unremarkable. That was exactly how Cooper wanted it. He started with the horses, 3 retired cavalry mounts he'd adopted after leaving the service. They nickered softly as he approached their paddock, more companions than livestock. As he checked their water and distributed fresh hay, his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, an old habit he'd never tried to break. The morning's first cup of coffee came after the horses were tended. Cooper sat on his porch, watching the sun paint the mountains pink and gold. Scout lay at his feet, ears occasionally twitching at distant sounds. The dog's situational awareness rivaled that of some soldiers Cooper had trained. His mind drifted to those years at Fort Bragg, where he'd spent 2 decades shaping America's elite warriors. He'd taught them more than just survival skills and combat techniques. He'd taught them to think, to adapt, to turn seemingly harmless environments into tactical advantages. Some of his methods had been unconventional, but his results spoke for themselves. The men he'd trained had the highest survival rates in the field. The distant rumble of an engine drew his attention. A pickup truck appeared on the county road, slowing as it passed his property. Cooper noted the unfamiliar vehicle, memorizing its details without appearing to look directly at it. 3rd such vehicle this week, all following the same pattern. He'd chosen this place carefully after retirement, remote enough for privacy but close enough to civilization for practicality. Pine Valley Township lay 10 miles to the east, a small community of farmers, ranchers, and people who valued their independence. Lately, though, something had been disturbing the valley's quiet rhythm. Rising from his chair, Cooper moved to his workshop behind the house. The space appeared to be a typical farmer's workshop, tools organized on pegboards, equipment parts waiting for repair, bags of seed stacked in corners. But behind a false panel lay reminders of his previous life, communication equipment, surveillance gear, and a small arsenal he maintained more out of habit than expectation of need. He checked the motion sensor feeds, another typical farmer precaution that would have surprised his neighbors. All sectors clear, but something felt off. Years of training others to trust their instincts had taught Cooper to trust his own. Scout's subtle change in posture confirmed his suspicions. The dog's ears were forward, his body tense but still. Cooper had trained him to alert quietly, another skill that would have seemed odd for a simple farm dog. Something was coming to Pine Valley. Cooper could feel it in the air, in the increased traffic of unfamiliar vehicles, in the way scouts' behavior had changed over the past week. He'd taught Special Forces operators to read these signs, to sense when an area's pattern of life was shifting. Later that morning, as he headed into town for supplies, Cooper reminded himself that he was just a farmer now. But some skills once learned never really went away. They just waited, dormant, until circumstances required their use. Greater than. Pine Valley's only grocery store doubled as its primary source of local news. Cooper pushed his cart through Miller's Market, noting how conversations fell quiet as he passed. Sarah Miller, whose family had run the store for 3 generations, looked up from her register as he approached. "Morning, Mr. Cooper," she said, her usual cheerful tone strained. "Did you see the paper today?" He hadn't, but the headline on the rack beside the counter caught his eye. "Motorcycle gang activity spreads to neighboring Harrison County." Below it, a photo showed a burned-out storefront. "Third county this month," Sarah continued, scanning his modest purchases. "They're calling themselves the Iron Wolves. Started in Idaho, working their way east." She lowered her voice. "Sheriff Thompson says it's just a matter of time before they reach us." Cooper nodded, maintaining his facade of mild concern appropriate for a local farmer. But his mind was already processing the information tactically, the way he'd taught his students. Geographic expansion patterns, resource control, terror tactics. "Folks are worried," Sarah added, bagging his groceries. "The Hendersons over in Harrison County? Their dairy farm's been in the family for 60 years. Gang burned their barn when they wouldn't pay protection money. Now everyone's paying, just to be safe." Outside, Cooper loaded his truck, scanning the parking lot with practiced casualness. 3 more unfamiliar vehicles had appeared since he'd entered the store, all with out-of-state plates, all with men who didn't quite fit the local pattern. Scout, waiting patiently in the truck bed, had his ears forward. The dog's attention was fixed on a group of men lingering near a black SUV. They were trying too hard to look casual, a tell Cooper had taught his students to recognize. On the drive home, Cooper counted 4 more suspicious vehicles. They were staging, establishing presence before making their move. It was a pattern he'd seen before, though usually in more hostile territories. He took an indirect route home, making a loop that passed the Henderson place just across the county line. The burned barn was still standing, its charred beams a warning to others. Fresh graffiti marked the remaining walls, a wolf's head in blood-red paint. Back at his farm, Cooper made a deliberate show of unloading groceries and returning to routine tasks. But his mind was racing through scenarios, counting resources, identifying potential allies and vulnerabilities. He'd taught Special Forces teams to do the same before every operation. That evening, more vehicles passed his property than usual. Their pace was slow, observant, marking territory. Through his workshop's hidden surveillance system, Cooper captured images of each one, license plates, driver descriptions, passenger counts. He'd taught his students that good intelligence was the foundation of any successful operation. Just before sunset, a group of motorcycles roared past his front gate. Their leather jackets bore the same wolf's head he'd seen painted on the Henderson barn. They were making their presence known, letting the community stew in its fear before making demands. Cooper prepared for nightfall with the same methodical attention he'd given his morning routine, but now each action had dual purpose. Checking the horses became establishing a forward observation post. Securing tools doubled as positioning emergency weapons caches. Even Scout's evening walk served as a patrol route check. As darkness fell, Cooper activated additional security measures, systems that would have seemed excessive for a simple farmer, but were second nature to someone who'd spent decades training others to survive. The iron wolves were coming to Pine Valley. Cooper had no doubt about that now. What they didn't know, what none of his neighbors knew, was that they weren't just dealing with an aging farmer. They were dealing with the man who'd taught America's best soldiers how to think like the predators they hunted. And some lessons, Cooper knew, were best taught the hard way. Greater than. The Pine Valley Farmers Market sprawled across the town square every Saturday morning, a tradition as old as the community itself. Cooper arrived early, his truck bed loaded with crates of fresh produce. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh bread from Mary Chen's bakery stall and coffee from the local diner's portable stand. As he set up his modest display of vegetables, Cooper noted the unusually thin crowd. Normally, the market would be bustling by now, but fear had a way of disrupting routine. He counted only half the usual number of vendors. "Jim, over here!" Tom Reynolds, who ran the hardware store, waved him over. Cooper made his way through the scattered stalls, observing how the remaining vendors huddled in tight groups, conversations hushed and nervous. "Thought you might want to hear this," Tom said, gesturing to a group that included Bill Henderson, whose barn had been burned. The dairy farmer looked haggard, aged years in just weeks. "They started small," Henderson was saying, his voice tight. "Just a few bikes at first, riding through town. Then more came. Started hanging around the diner, making comments about how dangerous the roads were getting, how accidents could happen." Cooper listened, his farmer's demeanor masking the tactical assessment running through his mind. The Iron Wolves were following a classic insurgency playbook: infiltrate, intimidate, control. He'd taught counterinsurgency techniques to special forces teams facing similar tactics overseas. "When we didn't pay," Henderson continued, "they cut our fence. Cattle got out onto Highway 12, nearly caused a massive accident. Sheriff couldn't prove anything, of course. Next was the barn." Mary Chen joined the group, wringing her hands in her apron. "They were at my shop yesterday," she said quietly. "Said their membership fees were reasonable compared to the cost of replacing a plate glass window. I don't know what to do." Cooper watched other vendors drift toward their group, drawn by shared fear. He noted which ones were already resigned to paying, which still showed signs of resistance. In their faces he saw the same expressions he'd observed in villages under siege, people losing faith in their ability to resist. "Has anyone actually seen their full numbers?" Cooper asked, keeping his tone casual. Years of training soldiers had taught him how to extract intelligence without alerting targets. "Joey at the gas station counted 15 bikes Tuesday," Tom offered. "But Billy saw at least 25 headed toward their new compound yesterday." "Compound?" Cooper's interest sharpened, though his expression remained neutral. "Old McKinnon place out on Route 7, Mary explained. They just moved in last week, putting up fences, bringing in supplies. Sheriff says they bought it legal, nothing he can do." Cooper mentally mapped the location. The McKinnon ranch had good sight lines, multiple access routes, defensible positions. Someone in the gang had tactical training, another detail to file away. A motorcycle's roar cut through the morning air. Conversation stopped as 3 bikes cruised slowly past the market. Their riders wore leather jackets emblazoned with the Iron Wolves emblem, openly displaying sidearms, illegal in town limits, but the sheriff's cruiser was conspicuously absent. Cooper watched the bikes through his peripheral vision, noting details his students would have been tested on: riding formations, weapons placement, communication patterns. The center rider, clearly a lieutenant based on his patches, made eye contact with several vendors. The message was clear: "We're watching." As the bikes disappeared around the corner, the market's atmosphere changed. Vendors began packing up early, citing various excuses. The community spirit was breaking, exactly as the gang intended. "What are we supposed to do?" Mary asked nobody in particular. "We can't fight them. We can't leave. Some of our families have been here for generations. Cooper started back toward his stall, mind working through scenarios. He'd trained Special Forces operators to handle situations like this, taught them how to turn a community's strengths against its oppressors. The Iron Wolves were following a predictable playbook, which meant their weaknesses were also predictable. As he loaded his unsold produce back into his truck, Cooper noticed something that would have seemed insignificant to most observers. The gang members had been recording their ride through the market on helmet-mounted cameras. They were documenting their intimidation campaign, probably for recruiting purposes. It was the kind of detail he'd trained his students to look for, the small things that could ultimately unravel an enemy's entire operation. The iron. Wolves thought they were creating a record of their dominance. Instead, they were providing evidence that could be used against them. Scout rode home in the truck's cab this time, sensing his master's tension. Cooper drove slowly, his farmer's patience concealing the tactical wheels turning in his mind. He'd spent 20 years teaching Special Forces operators how to solve problems exactly like this. Maybe it was time to put those lessons into practice again. Greater than. After returning from the market, Cooper didn't immediately unload his truck. Instead, he walked his property line, appearing to check his fences. To any observer, he looked like a conscientious farmer responding to Henderson's cattle story. In reality, he was conducting a security assessment exactly as he'd taught countless Special Forces teams. "Watch and learn, Scout," he muttered to the border collie trotting beside him. The phrase triggered a memory, standing before a class of Green Berets, explaining how to read terrain. "Your environment isn't just scenery," he'd told them. "It's your greatest asset or your biggest vulnerability, your choice." Cooper paused at his western fence line, ostensibly examining a post. His true attention was on the ridgeline half a mile away, perfect for surveillance. He'd chosen this property partly for its defendability, a habit he'd never quite shaken. Now, that choice seemed prescient. Back in his workshop, Cooper moved the false panel, concealing his security equipment. The system was modest by military standards, but far beyond typical farmer preparations. Motion sensors covered key approaches. Cameras monitored blind spots. He'd installed it all gradually over 5 years, making purchases through different suppliers to avoid attention. "Time to wake up the rest," he said to Scout, powering up additional sensors he'd kept dormant. A topographical map of his property filled one screen, showing coverage zones. On another, camera feeds cycled through different approaches to his farm. Cooper opened a locked cabinet and removed a worn leather journal, his teaching diary from Fort Bragg. Inside were not just lesson plans, but detailed analyses of how insurgent groups operated, how they could be countered. He'd developed these techniques over decades, testing and refining them through his students' real-world experiences. "First step, pattern recognition," he read aloud, his voice falling into the cadence of an instructor. "Before any counter-operation, understand your opponent's routine. Their habits are their vulnerabilities." He began logging the Iron Wolves' movements, comparing them to similar groups he'd studied. Their harassment followed predictable stages: intimidation, isolation, escalation. But their tactical sophistication suggested military experience among their leadership. As sunset approached, Cooper climbed into his hayloft with a pair of high-powered binoculars. He'd chosen this spot years ago for its excellent view of surrounding roads. A thermos of coffee and Scout's quiet company made the surveillance feel almost natural. "Remember this setup, boy?" he asked the dog. "Just like teaching recon at Bragg. Amazing how many students forgot to check high ground." Scout's ears twitched in response, monitoring sounds Cooper's aging ears might miss. Through his binoculars, Cooper tracked another group of Iron Wolves bikes moving through the valley. Their patterns were becoming clear. They traveled in groups of 3 to 5, maintaining radio contact. Their route suggested systematic territory mapping. In his workshop that night, Cooper began creating a detailed profile of the gang's operations. He'd taught his students that knowledge was the foundation of any successful resistance. Gang members' descriptions, vehicle details, patrol patterns, everything went into his analysis. He also began preparing his property, though not in obvious ways. Brush was cleared from certain angles, creating clear fields of view. Tools were redistributed to strategic locations, each placement carefully considered. To anyone watching, it would appear to be normal farm maintenance. "Got to think like them to beat them," he muttered, another teaching phrase from his past. He began marking potential observation posts where gang members might set up surveillance. Each would need to be subtly denied or controlled. A motorcycle's distant rumble prompted Cooper to kill the workshop lights. Through his security feeds, he watched 3 bikes pass slowly by his front gate. Their helmet cameras glinted in the moonlight, gathering intelligence of their own. "Amateur hour," Cooper whispered to Scout. "Never let your surveillance gear reflect light." It was the kind of basic mistake he'd drilled out of his students. The Iron Wolves might have some tactical training, but they lacked professional discipline. Cooper worked late into the night, falling easily back into the mission planning mindset he'd taught for so many years. On paper, he sketched defensive positions, escape routes, and counter-surveillance plans. Each notation was coded, a habit from his teaching days when operational security was paramount. As he finally prepared for bed, Cooper heard more motorcycles in the distance. The Iron Wolves were increasing their presence, growing bolder. They thought they were hunting sheep, but they'd stumbled onto an old wolf's territory. The thought brought a grim smile to his face as he checked his security feeds one last time. "Remember what I always told the class, Scout?" he said, scratching the dog's ears. "The best ambush is the one your target walks into, thinking it's their idea." The old training maxims were coming back easily now, rising to the surface like muscle memory. The Iron Wolves were about to learn why Cooper's Special Forces students had called him the Farmer long before he'd ever bought this land. He'd taught them that anything could be a weapon, any terrain could be turned to advantage, and the most dangerous opponent was the one you underestimated. Greater than. The Iron Wolves chose a Wednesday morning to make their first move. Cooper was in his front yard, methodically sharpening his scythe, when the rumble of motorcycles broke the morning calm. Scout's ears pricked up seconds before the sound reached human hearing range. "Right on schedule," Cooper murmured, continuing his rhythmic strokes with the whetstone. Through subtle shifts of his gaze, he counted 6 bikes approaching, a show of force meant to intimidate, but not their full strength. Classic first contact tactics. The motorcycles pulled into his driveway in a practiced formation, kicking up dust that drifted across his recently weeded garden beds. Their leader, a massive man with a graying beard and forearms covered in faded military tattoos, cut his engine. The others followed suit, creating a sudden silence broken only by the scrape of Cooper's whetstone. "That's some nice land you got here, old-timer," the leader said, swinging off his bike. His vest identified him as Butcher. Cooper noted the combat boots, the way he carried his weight, the unit insignias mixed in with his tattoos. Former military, though not special forces. Regular infantry, probably. "Gets the job done," Cooper replied mildly, testing the scythe's edge with his thumb. His posture remained relaxed, but his position gave him clear sight lines to all 6 riders. He'd taught his students that positioning was the foundation of survival. "Way I hear it, farming's getting dangerous around these parts," Butcher said, moving closer. His boots crunched on the gravel deliberately, another intimidation tactic. Lot of accidents happening, equipment breaking down, fences getting cut, fires starting. Cooper set down his scythe, carefully positioning it within easy reach. "That so?" 2 riders circled wide, trying to flank him. Cooper appeared to ignore them, but he'd already noted their weapons. pistols under their vests, knife on the left boot of one. Amateurs telegraphing their capabilities. Fortunately, Butcher continued, the Iron Wolves offer protection services. Insurance, you might say. Small monthly fee keeps those accidents from happening. He smiled, showing gold-capped teeth. Real reasonable rates for elderly folks like yourself. Cooper straightened slowly, his movements measured. To the gang, he probably looked like an old man being careful with his back. In reality, he was positioning himself optimally relative to their positions, just as he'd taught countless students. That's a generous offer, Cooper said, his voice carrying just enough edge to make Butcher's smile falter slightly. But I learned long ago to be careful about the company I keep. One of the flanking riders laughed. Ain't about company, Gramps, it's about survival. Ask the Hendersons how saying no worked out for them. Cooper turned slightly, appearing to face the speaker but actually improving his tactical position. Seems to me, he said quietly, that men who prey on their neighbors ain't much different from the coyotes that go after my chickens. His eyes met Butcher's. And I deal with predators myself. Something in his tone made Butcher take a half step back before catching himself. The leader's eyes narrowed, reassessing. Cooper could almost see him processing the subtle wrongness, the old farmer who didn't show fear, who moved too deliberately. Think about it, Butcher said, his voice hardening. We'll be back in a few days for your answer. Be smart about this, old man. Would hate to see anything happen to this nice place. The bikes roared to life, but Cooper noticed their departure was hastier than their arrival. As they peeled out of his driveway, Scout moved to his side, hackles still raised. They'll be back all right, Cooper said, watching dust clouds fade on the horizon. But not in a few days. That was too easy. They'll report up their chain, try to figure out why I didn't scare. He picked up his scythe, testing its weight, which gives us time to prepare. Inside his workshop, Cooper activated his recording system, downloading footage of the encounter from hidden cameras. He'd taught his students to document everything. Intelligence gathering didn't stop when the action started. The Iron Wolves had made their first move, but they'd revealed more than they'd gained. Cooper had seen the surprise in Butcher's eyes, the moment of uncertainty. They'd expected a frightened old farmer. Instead, they'd found something they couldn't quite identify. First rule of tactical response, Cooper said to Scout, echoing one of his favorite teaching phrases, let your opponent underestimate you. Their confusion is your advantage. Now the real work would begin. The Iron Wolves would be back, and next time they'd bring more muscle, more aggression. Cooper needed to be ready, not just to defend his farm, but to begin the counter-offensive he'd been planning since he first heard their bikes in his valley. Greater than. The attack came 3 nights after Butcher's visit, just as Cooper had predicted. His security system registered the first movement at 2:17 a.m., 4 heat signatures approaching his southern fence line on foot. The Iron Wolves were right on schedule, following the same playbook they'd used against Henderson. Cooper sat in his darkened workshop, watching thermal feeds on his monitors. Scout lay silently at his feet, trained to remain quiet during operations. The old, familiar tension of a mission filled Cooper's chest, not fear, but the focused alertness he'd drilled into hundreds of Special Forces candidates. Amateur hour, he whispered, watching the gang members approach. They'd parked their bikes half a mile down the road thinking they were being stealthy, but they'd chosen the most obvious approach route, hadn't bothered checking for surveillance, and were silhouetted against the skyline multiple times. I failed students for less, Cooper muttered, remembering nights at Fort Bragg when he'd taught infiltration techniques. His hand instinctively reached for a weapon before he caught himself. This wasn't a military operation. He needed to maintain his cover as a simple farmer, even while countering their attack. The gang members reached his fence, their bolt cutters glinting in the moonlight. Cooper had deliberately left this section looking vulnerable, but he'd reinforced it underneath the weathered exterior. They'd waste precious time trying to cut through. "First rule of defense," he whispered to Scout, falling into his instructor's cadence. "Let the enemy waste resources on hardened targets while thinking they're soft." The dog's ears twitched in response, tracking sounds too faint for human ears. Through his thermal imaging, Cooper watched them struggle with the reinforced fence wire. Their frustration was evident in their body language. One man moved to their backup plan, pulling out spray paint for the gang's signature wolf tag. Cooper allowed himself a grim smile. The cameras were capturing everything: faces, actions, evidence. But he needed more than just documentation. He needed to send a message while maintaining his cover. The gang members froze at a sudden sound, the automated sprinkler system Cooper had installed after hearing about the Henderson incident. The heavy-duty agricultural sprinklers engaged with enough pressure to send the would-be vandals scrambling backward, thoroughly soaked. Normal farmers had sprinkler systems. Normal farmers might even set them for night watering. Only someone with Cooper's training would notice how the spray pattern perfectly covered likely approach routes to his fence line. "Control the battle space," he murmured, another lesson from his teaching days. "Make the environment itself your weapon." The gang members retreated, cursing and dripping. But Cooper knew this was just the beginning. They'd be back, with greater numbers and more destructive intent. That's why he'd allowed this first attempt to succeed in reaching the fence. He needed to assess their tactics, their capabilities, their responses to unexpected obstacles. He'd learned long ago that the best way to teach was to let students make small mistakes so they wouldn't make fatal ones later. The Iron Wolves were about to become unwitting students in tactics they couldn't hope to understand. After the gang members disappeared into the night, Cooper began his after-action routine. He documented everything: their approach vectors, equipment, reactions. Each detail would help him prepare for their next move. "They'll report this as a lucky accident," he told Scout, as they walked the property line at dawn, checking for any evidence the gang had left behind. "A regular farmer's sprinkler system just happened to go off. That's good. Let them underestimate us for now." He found their bolt cutters abandoned in their hasty retreat. Cheap hardware store models, nothing special. But they'd left something more valuable: boot prints in the mud created by the sprinklers. Cooper photographed them carefully. Individual identification might be useful later. The morning sun revealed the gang's attempted graffiti: a half-finished wolf's head, dripping red paint. Cooper left it there. Let them think they'd at least partially succeeded. Let them think he was just a lucky old farmer with good timing on his irrigation system. But as he went about his morning chores, his mind was already gaming out their next likely moves. The Iron Wolves would escalate. Pride would demand it. They'd come in greater numbers next time, try something more damaging than fence cutting. "That's all right," Cooper said to Scout as they headed in for breakfast. "Sometimes you have to let the enemy think they're winning to get them exactly where you want them." It was another lesson from his teaching days, one that had saved lives in real combat zones. The Iron Wolves thought they were dealing with a simple farmer who'd gotten lucky. They had no idea they were being drawn into an elaborate trap by a man who'd spent decades teaching others how to think 10 steps ahead. Greater than. Pine Valley's town hall was packed for the emergency community meeting, the atmosphere thick with tension. Cooper chose a spot near the back, positioning himself where he could observe everyone's faces. He'd taught his students that crowd dynamics could reveal as much intelligence as surveillance photos. Sheriff Mike Thompson stood at the podium, his weathered face grave. "Folks, I know you're all concerned about the Iron Wolves situation. We've had 12 reported incidents in the past week alone: vandalism, threatening behavior, property damage." Cooper scanned the crowd, noting who nodded, who looked away, who seemed resigned. Mary Chen from the bakery had a fresh bruise on her wrist. Tom Reynolds kept glancing nervously at the windows. The community was already showing classic signs of submission to threat. "We've contacted the state police," Thompson continued, "but without concrete evidence of major crimes, their hands are tied. The gang's got legitimate ownership of the McKinnon property, and they're careful to keep most activities just under the legal threshold for serious intervention." "What about my barn?" Bill Henderson stood up, his voice cracking. "That wasn't under any threshold." "By the time fire crews arrived, any evidence was destroyed," Thompson replied, the frustration evident in his voice. "And without witnesses willing to testify." Cooper noted how that statement made several people shift uncomfortably in their seats. Fear was doing the gang's work for them, making the community silence itself. Sarah Miller raised her hand tentatively. "They came to the store yesterday, said their protection fees are doubling next month. We can barely afford the current rate." A murmur of angry agreement swept through the crowd. Cooper counted at least 15 business owners nodding. The gang's extortion network was larger than he'd initially estimated. "Maybe." Tom Reynolds spoke hesitantly. "Maybe if we all agreed to stop paying at once." "They can't intimidate everyone." "They don't have to," Cooper said quietly, his first contribution to the meeting. Heads turned toward him. "They just have to make an example of one or two who resist. Fear does the rest." "What would you know about it?" someone called out. "Your place hasn't been hit yet." Cooper didn't bother correcting them about the night incident. Let the gang think their failure hadn't been reported. Instead, he asked, "Anyone notice how they choose their targets?" "There's a pattern." The room fell silent, considering. Sheriff Thompson leaned forward. "What kind of pattern, Mr. Cooper?" "They start with the vulnerable," Cooper explained, using the same tone he'd used to teach tactical analysis. "Isolated properties first, like Henderson's, then businesses that can't afford security. They're working their way up, building momentum through easy victories." He stood, moving to the town map on the wall. "Look at their property acquisitions. The McKinnon place gives them sight lines over the main valley. Their patrols follow supply routes. They're not just bullies, they're executing a strategic territorial takeover." Cooper could feel the room's attention sharpening. He'd taught his students that understanding an enemy's methodology was the first step to defeating them. These people needed that understanding to overcome their fear. "So what do we do?" Mary Chen asked, unconsciously rubbing her bruised wrist. Before Cooper could respond, the rumble of motorcycles filled the air. Through the town hall windows, they could see 3 Iron Wolves bikes circling the building slowly, their riders filming with helmet cameras. The effect on the crowd was immediate. People shrank in their seats. Conversations died. Cooper watched the community spirit deflate in real time, exactly as the gang intended. Sheriff Thompson tried to regain control. "Now, folks, we can't let them intimidate us into inaction. We need to stick together, report everything, build a case." But Cooper could see his words weren't landing. The community was already beaten, not by physical force, but by psychological warfare. He'd seen it before in conflict zones. Once fear took root, it was harder to fight than any tangible enemy. As the meeting dissolved into frightened whispers and hasty departures, Cooper lingered, mentally cataloging everything he'd learned. The gang's strategy was more sophisticated than he'd initially thought, but their reliance on fear was also a weakness. Fear could be turned against them. Walking home under the stars, Scout alert beside him, Cooper remembered another lesson he'd taught at Fort Bragg. The most effective resistance doesn't just fight the enemy, it breaks their psychological hold on the battlefield. Pine Valley had become that battlefield. The Iron Wolves thought they were breaking the community's spirit. Instead, they were providing Cooper with everything he needed to engineer their downfall. He just needed to help his neighbors remember something he'd spent 20 years teaching America's elite soldiers. The biggest weapon in any fight isn't guns or numbers, it's the courage to stand up when standing up seems impossible. Greater than, the black Ford pickup that pulled into Cooper's driveway the next morning wouldn't have attracted attention in ranch country. But Cooper recognized the deliberate way it approached, maintaining clear sight lines, watching angles, ready to reverse if necessary. He'd taught those driving techniques himself. Scout's tail started wagging before the driver's door opened. The dog remembered Captain Michael Torres, even though it had been 3 years since his last visit. Cooper watched his former student approach, noting that civilian life hadn't softened the precision in his movements. "Getting sloppy, farmer," Torres called out, grinning. "Your south ridge has 3 perfect sniper positions with clear views of your front door." "4 positions," Cooper corrected, returning the grin. "You missed the one behind the old oak. You're the one getting sloppy, Captain." They clasped hands warmly, but Cooper could see the concern behind Torres's easy manner. "I heard some interesting chatter," Torres said, his voice dropping. "Thought I'd check on my favorite instructor." Cooper led him into the workshop where they could talk privately. Torres whistled at the surveillance setup. "Nice command center. Planning for trouble?" "Trouble's already here," Cooper replied, bringing up the footage from the night attack. "Iron Wolves motorcycle gang, moving through the valley like a military operation. Someone's giving them tactical training." Torres watched the thermal images intently. "Yeah, I heard about them. Started in Idaho, working east. Word is they've got some ex-military leadership." He paused. "That's not why I'm here, though." Cooper raised an eyebrow, waiting. Torres had been one of his best students, patient, methodical, able to see the bigger picture. Now he pulled out his phone, showing Cooper a series of messages. "Started getting texts from other guys you trained? Henderson's barn burning made the military grapevine. When someone mentioned Pine Valley, we connected the dots. You've got a lot of former students worried about their old teacher." "I can handle some weekend warriors playing soldier," Cooper said, but he was touched by the concern. He'd trained hundreds of Special Forces operators over 20 years, taught them to think strategically, to see beneath the surface of situations. "Sure you can," Torres agreed. "Question is, should you have to handle it alone?" He gestured at the surveillance screens. "You taught us that solo operators, no matter how good, are vulnerable. Team dynamics multiply capabilities." Cooper remembered teaching that lesson. He'd used farming analogies back then, how a single stalk of wheat could be easily broken, but a bundle was nearly impossible to snap. The irony wasn't lost on him. "These people aren't soldiers," Cooper said quietly, bringing up footage of the town hall meeting. "They're farmers, shopkeepers, ordinary folks being terrorized by thugs who think tactical gear makes them warriors." Torres watched the fear in the townspeople's faces, his expression hardening. "You taught us something else, too. The best weapon against terror isn't firepower. It's showing people they don't have to be afraid." A motorcycle's roar interrupted them. Through the workshop window, they watched 3 Iron Wolves riders cruise past, conducting their regular intimidation patrol. Torres noted their formation with professional interest. "Sloppy," he muttered. "Wide spacing, poor situational awareness. They're relying on reputation, not skill." He turned to Cooper. "You're not just some farmer they can push around. You're the man who trained half the Special Forces operators active in the past 2 decades. Let us help." Cooper considered his former student's words. He'd stayed out of military matters since retiring, content to work his land and live quietly. But watching his community crumble under the Iron Wolves' pressure had awakened something in him, the same instinct that had made him an effective instructor. "I can't ask you to risk your career," Cooper said finally. "If this goes bad—" Torres laughed. "You never had to ask us to do anything, farmer. You just taught us to recognize when something needed doing." He pulled out a satellite phone, unofficial, untraceable. "Half your former students are in positions to help now. Federal law enforcement, military intelligence, private security. The network's there if you want it." Cooper looked at his surveillance screens, at the evidence of his community's fear, at the gang's growing boldness. He remembered another lesson he'd taught. Sometimes the best way to honor peace was to stand ready to defend it. "Make your calls," he said finally, "but quietly. We do this smart, like we trained. No cowboys, no heroics." "Just like you taught us," Torres agreed, already dialing. Strategic thinking, tactical patience, and making the enemy's strength into their weakness. Cooper watched his former student coordinating with old classmates, speaking in the clipped phrases of professional operators. The Iron Wolves thought they were dealing with a simple farmer. They were about to learn why Cooper's students called him the farmer, long before he ever bought this land. Greater than. Cooper's workshop had transformed overnight. Torres had brought equipment that made Cooper's surveillance setup look like a hobbyist's toy: high-resolution thermal cameras, directional microphones, and encrypted communication gear that would have been at home in any Special Forces command center. "Still remember how to run tactical surveillance?" Torres asked, setting up a multi-screen display that would give them coverage of the entire valley. "Like riding a bike," Cooper replied, already establishing observation patterns. "Though in training, we never had gear this good. Used to make students track targets with binoculars and hand-drawn maps." "Yeah, and we hated you for it," Torres grinned, "until we ended up in the field with dead batteries and had to fall back on the basics you drilled into us." They worked methodically, the way Cooper had taught his classes. First, establishing baseline patterns, the gang's regular movements, their patrol routes, their shift changes at the McKinnon compound. Every detail was logged, analyzed, and cross-referenced. "They're running 3-man patrols," Cooper noted, marking routes on a digital map. "Always the same pattern: main road, back roads, then past potential targets. Classic intimidation routing." Torres nodded, adding data to their growing database. "Got IDs on most of their bikes now. 37 distinct vehicles, but not all active at once. They're rotating crews, trying to look bigger than they are." Cooper watched a patrol pass on their screens. "See how the lead rider keeps checking his 6? Military training, not special forces. Movements are too rigid. Regular infantry, maybe MPs. Their leader, Butcher." Torres pulled up a file. Found his service record: Staff Sergeant James Butcher Mallory, dishonorable discharge in 19, started running with outlaw bikers after that. Through their surveillance, patterns emerged. The Iron Wolves weren't just random thugs. They were operating with military precision, albeit sloppily executed. Their compound was arranged in defensive positions. Their communications followed military protocols. "They're trying to run it like a fire base," Cooper observed, remembering similar setups he'd taught students to analyze. "But they're making basic mistakes. Look at their blind spots." He marked several areas on the map where the gang's security had gaps. Torres whistled softly. "They really think they're operators, playing soldier with their tactical gear and radio codes, but they never had you beating proper procedures into their heads." A call came in on Torres's encrypted line. "Got something interesting," a voice reported. "Ran financial traces on their property purchase. Money came through a series of shells, but original source looks like cartel backing." Cooper absorbed this information, adding it to his mental map of the situation. Not just taking over territory for protection rackets. They're setting up distribution infrastructure. "Makes sense," Torres agreed. "Isolated location, good road access, compromised local law enforcement. Perfect staging area for moving product." They spent the afternoon documenting vehicle movements, photographing gang members, and mapping patrol patterns. Cooper approached it like he was building a training scenario, identifying key terrain, noting choke points, marking potential response routes. "Remember teaching us about pattern analysis?" Torres asked, reviewing their data. "How real intelligence isn't about collecting information, but understanding what it means." Cooper nodded, seeing the patterns emerging. The Iron Wolves were following a playbook, one he'd studied and taught counters to for years. Their military background made them more dangerous than typical gangs, but also more predictable. They're expanding too fast, he noted, trying to control too much territory with too few men, classic overextension. It was the kind of mistake he'd taught his students to recognize and exploit. As evening approached, they had a clear picture of the gang's operations. Numbers, movements, capabilities, all documented and analyzed. But Cooper knew intelligence was only the first step. "What's the word from your contacts?" he asked Torres, who was coordinating with other former students. "Got 8 operators within 6 hours' drive, all experienced, all reliable. DEA has an ongoing investigation, but they're months from moving. FBI's watching, but needs more evidence." Cooper studied their tactical map, remembering exercises he'd run at Fort Bragg. "We're not looking to take them head on. That's not our play." "No," Torres agreed, understanding his old instructor's thinking. "We're going to do what you taught us, turn their strength into weakness, make them defeat themselves." As a darkness fell, Cooper watched another gang patrol pass his farm. They were still filming, still trying to project strength through intimidation. But now every movement they made was being logged, analyzed, and prepared for counteraction. "Time to write the lesson plan," Cooper said quietly, falling into his instructor's mindset. The Iron Wolves thought they were the predators in this valley. They were about to become part of a very different kind of training exercise. Greater than. Scout's urgent barking woke Cooper at 3:47 a.m. The border collie wasn't at his usual post by the bed. He was at the window, his posture rigid, growling low in his throat. Cooper was instantly alert, years of training overriding the fog of sleep. The surveillance monitors showed multiple heat signatures moving across his property. But something was different this time. Their movement pattern wasn't cautious. It was aggressive, purposeful. "They're done playing games," Torres said, appearing silently in the doorway, already geared up. Cooper nodded, quickly pulling on his boots. A horse screamed, a sound that cut through the night like a knife. Cooper's heart clenched. He'd heard that sound before, in combat zones where livestock became casualties of human conflicts. "Don't react," he said sharply, as Torres moved toward the door. "That's what they want. They're watching for our response." Through the thermal imaging, they could see 4 figures retreating from the horse paddock. Their body language showed excitement, adrenaline. This wasn't impersonal vandalism. This was deliberate cruelty designed to provoke. Cooper moved to the paddock with measured steps, forcing himself to maintain the pace of a concerned farmer rather than a combat veteran. The scene that greeted him made his stomach turn. Thunder, his oldest cavalry mount, lay on his side, blood darkening the dirt around him. The horse's legs had been hamstrung, a deliberate, professional job. Not random violence, but a calculated message. This was how you crippled a cavalry horse in combat. "Jesus," Torres breathed, coming up behind him. "They're escalating, making it personal." Cooper knelt beside Thunder, stroking the horse's neck. The animal's eyes were wild with pain and fear. "Get my rifle," he said quietly. "The old hunting one, not the tactical gear. Make sure they see you get it." He could feel the gang watching, probably filming. They wanted to see him afraid, angry, broken. Instead, he projected calm efficiency as he put Thunder down with a single, clean shot. The sound echoed through the valley like a declaration. "They're still watching," Torres reported through their concealed radio. 2 observation points, ridge line and tree cover east. "Good," Cooper replied softly. "Let them watch. Let them think this is breaking me." He began digging a grave for Thunder, each shovelful of dirt deliberate and measured. To observers, he would look like a devastated old farmer, burying a beloved animal. In reality, he was analyzing angles, distances, reaction times. The sun was rising by the time he finished. Torres had maintained watch, tracking the gang's observation teams as they finally withdrew, probably satisfied with the night's work. "They crossed a line," Torres said, as they walked back to the house. This wasn't just intimidation. This was a professional hit. That hamstringing technique, That's military. Cooper nodded, his face grave. They wanted to show they can hurt us, that they know tactical vulnerabilities. He paused. But they just gave us something more valuable. What's that? Confirmation of their capabilities. That knife work was special operations level, rules out regular infantry background, narrows down who we're dealing with. In the workshop, Cooper began updating their intelligence board. This wasn't random violence. It was a calculated escalation following standard insurgency doctrine. He'd taught counters to these exact tactics. Make the calls, he told Torres, but carefully. We need specific skill sets now. Someone who can trace special operations connections. Someone in federal law enforcement who can quietly track cartel links. They'll come harder next time, Torres warned. This was just a test run. Cooper looked at his former student, and for a moment Torres saw the instructor who'd forged some of America's deadliest warriors. No, they won't, because we're done playing defense. He turned to their tactical map, his voice taking on the cadence he'd used in countless training sessions. They think they've shown us our vulnerability. Instead, they've shown us their playbook. They're running this like a military operation, so we'll counter it like one. Through the window, they could see the fresh grave in the horse paddock. The gang had meant it to be a symbol of fear. Instead, they'd created something else, a reminder that some lines, once crossed, changed everything. Time to write the next lesson plan, Cooper said quietly. The Iron Wolves had just graduated from being a local nuisance to something far more serious. But they'd also made a critical mistake. They'd given a master instructor everything he needed to design their downfall. The only question was whether they'd realize their error before it was too late. Greater than. The morning after Thunder's death, Cooper's workshop hummed with encrypted communications. He sat at his desk, methodically working through a list of former students, while Torres coordinated through separate channels. Each call followed a pattern Cooper had taught in his courses: brief, coded, and untraceable. "Jack, it's the farmer," he said into the secure line. "Remember that scenario we ran in 15? The one with the compromised firebase? Might need your perspective on something similar." The FBI special agent on the other end understood immediately. Cooper had trained him to read between the lines. "Local or regional players?" Jack asked, his tone professional. "Started local, going regional, cartel connections emerging. You're a kind of puzzle." A pause. "Give me 4 hours. I'll see what flags I can raise quietly." Cooper moved down his list. 20 years of training Special Forces operators had left him with contacts throughout the military and law enforcement communities. Each call added another piece to his developing strategy. "They're asking about timeline," Torres reported, covering his own communications. "How long before we need boots on ground?" Cooper studied their tactical map, now marked with fresh intelligence. "Tell them to hold. We're not fighting the gang directly. We're dismantling their support structure, like that exercise in Jordan." Torres grinned, remembering. "The one where you had us collapse the smuggling ring by making them think their suppliers had turned? That was elegant." "This is similar. The Iron Wolves think their strength is their tactical knowledge, their cartel backing. That's actually their vulnerability." A new call came in, Sarah Chen from the State Police Tactical Unit. Another former student, though most locals would never guess the quiet baker's daughter had once been Cooper's star pupil in advanced infiltration techniques. "Getting interesting chatter, farmer," she reported. "Cartel's not happy with all the attention the wolves are drawing. They wanted quiet distribution routes, not terror tactics. Your gang's getting cocky, going off script." Cooper added this information to their growing intelligence picture. The Iron Wolves were following a military playbook, but they were missing the crucial element he'd drilled into his students: strategic patience. "What about the special operations angle?" he asked. "That hamstringing technique wasn't standard training." "Working that now," Sarah replied. Got someone pulling service records. Butcher's crew picked up some specialized talent recently. Guy named Marcus Ghost Riley, former Delta, went mercenary after discharge. Real piece of work. That explained the professional touch on Thunder's killing. Delta Force operators were among the best, but they were also predictable if you knew their methods. Cooper had trained enough of them to recognize their signatures. By midday, the picture was becoming clear. The Iron Wolves had military backbone, but undisciplined execution. They had cartel support, but were risking it with excessive violence. They had tactical training, but lacked strategic vision. "Look familiar?" Cooper asked Torres, who was updating their situation board. "Like that training scenario in New Mexico," Torres nodded. "The one where the team had all the right equipment but couldn't see the bigger picture. They kept winning small victories. Until they lost everything," Cooper finished, "because they didn't understand that tactical success doesn't equal strategic victory." Another call came in, this time from a DEA tactical team leader Cooper had trained. "Got movement on the cartel angle, Farmer. They're sending someone to evaluate the situation. Looks like the Wolves' recent activities have triggered a review." Perfect. Cooper had been counting on the cartel's business sense, overriding their commitment to the gang. Violence was bad for profits, attracted too much attention. "Keep monitoring," he instructed, "but no direct action yet. Let them create their own pressure points." As evening approached, Cooper's network was fully activated. Federal agencies were quietly monitoring, state police were gathering intelligence, and former students were standing by for support. But more importantly, cracks were appearing in the Iron Wolves' foundation. "What's our next move?" Torres asked, seeing the familiar look in his old instructor's eyes. Cooper traced a line on their tactical map, connecting seemingly unrelated points. "We let them think they're winning. Let them get bolder, more aggressive. Every step they take toward us is actually a step toward their own destruction." He looked at the fresh gray visible through his window, his voice hardening slightly. "They killed Thunder to show they could hurt us. Now we'll teach them the difference between causing pain and achieving victory." The Iron Wolves thought they'd sent a message of power. Instead, they'd triggered a response that would dismantle everything they'd built, piece by carefully planned piece. Greater than. Dawn hadn't yet broken when Cooper and Torres set up their observation post on a ridge overlooking the old McKinnon Ranch. They'd approached using the techniques Cooper had taught countless Special Forces teams, moving in darkness, using terrain for concealment, leaving no trace of their passage. "Just like old times," Torres whispered, setting up their surveillance equipment. "Though usually you were grading us on our observation techniques, not doing the recon yourself." Cooper adjusted his binoculars, studying the compound below. The Iron Wolves had transformed the peaceful ranch into something resembling a military forward operating base, guard towers at key points, reinforced gates, regular patrol patterns. "They've got military minds planning this," Cooper noted, sketching the layout in his weatherproof notebook. "Look at the firing lanes, the overlapping fields of view. Someone down there knows combat operations." Through high-powered optics, they watched the compound wake up. Guards changed shifts with military precision. Vehicles moved in established patterns. Everything screamed professional organization, but with telltale flaws that made Cooper smile grimly. "See their blind spot?" he asked Torres, pointing to a section of the perimeter. "They're relying too heavily on their technical security, motion sensors, cameras, forgetting the basics." Torres nodded. "Like that exercise you ran us through at Fort Bragg, when you showed us how to defeat our own security by thinking like the enemy." The morning sun revealed more details. The main barn had been converted into what looked like a command center, with communications equipment visible through the windows. The old ranch house served as barracks. New buildings had been added, workshops, garages, storage facilities. "Count the vehicles," Cooper instructed, falling into his teaching rhythm. Note arrival and departure patterns. They documented everything: 37 motorcycles matching their previous intelligence, 8 pickup trucks, 3 SUVs. The vehicles moved with purpose, suggesting regular supply runs and patrol schedules. "They're running it like a fire base," Torres observed, "but they're making rookie mistakes. Look at their vehicle staging, all clustered together, one well-placed explosive." "We're not here to blow things up," Cooper reminded him. "We're here to understand their operation, to find their vulnerabilities." Through their surveillance, patterns emerged. The Iron Wolves weren't just a gang, they were trying to be a paramilitary organization. Their members trained with weapons, practiced tactical movements, maintained military-style discipline. "Ghost is running their training," Torres noted, referring to the former Delta operator they'd identified. "You can see his influence in their procedures, but they're sloppy, undisciplined." Cooper watched a group practicing close-quarters combat techniques in a makeshift training area. They know the moves, but not the principles, like someone teaching cookbook recipes without understanding the science of cooking. By midday, they had a comprehensive picture of the compound's operations. Cooper had documented guard rotations, identified key personnel, mapped entry and exit routes. But more importantly, he'd spotted the flaws in their system. "They're overconfident," he explained, reviewing his notes, "relying on reputation and show of force rather than true security. Classic mistake of amateur operators trying to look professional." Torres studied the compound through their thermal imaging gear. "What's really interesting is what they're hiding," he said, pointing to a new building near the back of the property. "Temperatures being artificially maintained, consistent traffic pattern, has to be their distribution center." Cooper nodded. The cartel connection was becoming clearer. The Iron Wolves weren't just running protection rackets. They were setting up a major drug trafficking operation using intimidation of locals to secure their supply routes. "They've got 3 layers of security," Cooper noted, sketching the layout. "Outer perimeter patrols, electronic surveillance, and inner compound defenses. Looks impressive." "But," Torres prompted, recognizing his instructor's tone, "but they're thinking like soldiers, not criminals. Their security is designed to repel a frontal assault. They're not watching for subtle infiltration, psychological warfare, or attacks on their support structure." As they packed up their observation post, leaving no trace of their presence, Cooper's mind was already formulating plans. The Iron Wolves had built what they thought was an impregnable fortress. They'd forgotten one of the first lessons he'd taught his students: the strongest defenses mean nothing if your enemy never has to breach them. "They're looking outward," he told Torres, as they made their way back through the woods, watching for external threats. "They don't realize the real danger will come from within." The compound might have looked like a military installation, but Cooper had spent 20 years teaching soldiers how to think beyond obvious tactics. The Iron Wolves were about to learn that sometimes the most effective assault isn't an assault at all. Greater than. The Iron Wolves arrived at Cooper's farm in force just before noon, their motorcycles kicking up clouds of dust visible from miles away. Cooper counted 15 bikes plus 3 pickup trucks, a show of force meant to overwhelm any resistance. "Right on schedule," he murmured to Torres, who was monitoring their surveillance feeds from the workshop. "They're following standard intimidation protocol: maximum visibility, maximum noise." "Want me to call in backup?" Torres asked through their concealed radio. Cooper had positioned him out of sight, another card the gang didn't know was in play. "Negative. Let's see what they've brought to the lesson." Cooper continued sharpening his scythe on the front porch, his movements unhurried. Scout lay at his feet, appearing relaxed but coiled for action. They'd rehearsed this, knowing the gang would eventually try a direct approach. Butcher led the group, but Cooper's attention focused on the lean figure beside him, Marcus "Ghost" Riley, the former Delta operator. Ghost moved differently than the others, his eyes constantly scanning, assessing. Here was the real threat. "Nice day for a ride," Cooper called out as they approached, his tone mild. He kept working the whetstone along the scythe's blade, each stroke precise and controlled. "Could be," Butcher replied, trying to loom over Cooper's seated form. "Could also be a real bad day. Depends on how smart you're feeling." Cooper noted their positioning, standard intimidation formation, but with tactical elements. Ghost had automatically moved to cover the most advantageous firing position. Others were unconsciously spacing themselves for optimal fields of fire. Smart enough to know that 15 bikes and 3 trucks is a lot of machinery for a social call, Cooper observed, still focused on his blade work. Ghost spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the clipped precision of special operations training. "Smart enough to know what happened to your horse wasn't an accident?" "Wasn't much about that knife work that looked accidental," Cooper agreed, finally looking up. His eyes met Ghost's, and for a moment something passed between them, a recognition between professionals. "Then you know what comes next," Butcher growled. "Time to decide if you want to be a friend or an example." Cooper set down his whetstone but kept the scythe across his lap. The sun glinted off its freshly honed edge. "Seems to me there's another option you haven't considered." "Yeah? What's that?" "The possibility that you're making a serious tactical error." Cooper's voice remained conversational, but something in his tone made Ghost shift his stance slightly. Butcher laughed, but it sounded forced. "Look around, old man. You really think you're in a position to talk about tactical errors?" "I think," Cooper said quietly, "that you've got your men bunched too close together. Poor fields of fire, no clear exit routes, exactly the kind of mistakes that get soldiers killed in ambush situations." The subtle change in his voice, from farmer to instructor, made Ghost's eyes narrow. His hand drifted toward his concealed weapon. "Stand down, operator," Cooper said, using the same command tone he'd used on countless Special Forces trainees. "You're better than this cowboy nonsense." The use of military terminology, the automatic authority in his voice, made several gang members glance uncertainly at each other. Ghost's posture had gone rigid, recognition warring with disbelief. "You've got exactly 3 minutes," Cooper continued, "to get your people back to a reasonable tactical distance. Otherwise, we'll find out if you remember your counter-ambush training as well as you remember your knife work." "You threatening us, old man?" Butcher demanded, but uncertainty had crept into his bluster. "No threat, just a professional courtesy from one operator to another." Cooper's eyes stayed on Ghost. "You know what you're looking at here. Question is, are you going to be smart about it?" Ghost's tactical assessment was clearly warring with gang loyalty. Cooper had seen that internal struggle before in training exercises where objectives conflicted with proper procedure. "Back it up," Ghost said finally, his voice tight. "Reset perimeter, 20 yards. "The hell you say?" Butcher began, but Ghost cut him off. "Do it now, or I'm out. This isn't the play. Not here, not like this." The gang members, responding to the authority in his voice, began backing away. Cooper remained seated, outwardly relaxed, but his mind was marking their movements, noting who followed orders instantly and who hesitated. "This isn't over," Butcher snarled, but he was already moving toward his bike. "No," Cooper agreed quietly, "but it is educational." They roared away in a cloud of dust and wounded pride. Only Ghost remained for a moment, studying Cooper with new understanding. "Who were you?" he asked finally. "Just a farmer," Cooper replied, "who spent 20 years teaching soldiers how to think clearly in unclear situations." He paused. "Might want to consider if you're thinking clearly now, operator." Ghost's jaw tightened, but he nodded once before following his gang. Cooper watched them go, noting their disorganized retreat, nothing like their disciplined arrival. "Stand down," he said quietly into his concealed radio, "but log everything. We just learned a lot about their chain of command." The confrontation had revealed more than the Iron Wolves realized. Every reaction, every hesitation, every glance between members had told Cooper something about their organization. More importantly, he'd planted the first seed of doubt in their supposedly unshakable unity. Greater than. The day after the confrontation, Cooper began what appeared to be routine farm maintenance. To any observer, including the Iron Wolves' surveillance teams he knew were watching, he was simply a farmer preparing for winter. The reality was far more tactical. "Remember that exercise in Afghanistan?" Torres asked, helping Cooper move hay bales into seemingly random positions around the property. "Where you made us create defensive positions that didn't look defensive." "Best cover is the kind that serves a legitimate purpose," Cooper replied, carefully positioning each bale. To casual observers, they were winter feed storage. To trained eyes, they were perfectly placed cover points, creating interlocking fields of fire. They worked methodically, each task serving dual purposes. Old equipment was positioned to channel vehicle movement. Drainage ditches were deepened to serve as defensive trenches. Everything looked perfectly normal for a working farm. "They're still watching," Torres reported, noting movement on their surveillance feeds. "Two observation points, ridgeline, and that cluster of trees east of the road." "Good," Cooper nodded. "Let them watch. Let them think we're scared, fortifying out of fear." He paused in his work, deliberately wiping his brow where the observers could see him, looking uncertain, afraid. But the preparations were anything but fearful. Cooper was implementing defensive plans he'd taught Special Forces teams for years. Each position was carefully considered, each line of sight calculated. "Running supply lines through the irrigation pipes?" Torres asked, noting how Cooper was modifying the farm's water system. "Irrigation for the south field," Cooper replied loudly, for the benefit of any listeners. Then, quieter. "And a way to move between positions without being seen. Remember that night exercise where your team got trapped because they didn't establish covered movement routes?" Torres grimaced at the memory. "You failed our whole squad, made us repeat the entire week of training. And you never made that mistake again." They continued working through the afternoon. Cooper drove fence posts that could double as antenna mounts for their surveillance equipment. He positioned tool sheds that provided perfect sniper hides. Everything dual purpose, everything looking completely innocent. "Ghost will recognize some of this," Torres warned, referring to the former Delta operator. "He's got the training to see past the camouflage." "Counting on it," Cooper replied, adjusting the angle of a storage container. "Sometimes knowing there's a trap is more effective than the trap itself. Makes you hesitate, second-guess your moves." As sunset approached, Cooper surveyed their work. To uninformed eyes, his farm looked like any other property preparing for winter. To trained observers, it was now a carefully prepared defensive position. And, to someone like Ghost, it was a clear message. They weren't dealing with a simple farmer. "Starting to look like that training compound you designed at Bragg," Torres observed. "The one you used to teach advanced defensive operations." "Similar principles," Cooper agreed. "Multiple layers, overlapping fields of fire, concealed movement routes. But this time, we're not just preparing to repel attacks." He pointed to several positions that looked like simple farm storage. Each one was positioned to observe different approaches to neighboring properties. "We're not just defending my farm," he explained. "We're creating a base for protecting the whole valley. Remember what I taught about community defense?" Torres nodded. "The best defensive position is one that lets you protect others, not just yourself." They added final touches as darkness fell. Subtle lighting changes, slight adjustments to equipment placement, everything looking random but serving specific tactical purposes. "They'll come at night next time," Torres said, scanning the darkening horizon. "Try to prove they can get through our preparations." "That's what the second layer is for," Cooper replied, indicating preparations that weren't visible even to trained observers. He'd spent years teaching soldiers that the most effective defenses were the ones the enemy never saw. In his workshop that evening, Cooper updated their tactical maps with the new defensive positions. Each point was coded, each line of sight marked. 20 years of teaching defensive operations had taught him to think in layers: physical, psychological, tactical. "Remember what you always taught us about defensive preparations?" Torres asked, reviewing the plans. Cooper nodded. "The best defense isn't about stopping an enemy's advance. It's about controlling how and where they move." He studied their work with professional satisfaction. "The Iron Wolves think they're watching us build walls. Instead, we're building a cage. They just don't know it yet." The gang would eventually test their defenses, probably sooner rather than later. But Cooper had spent decades teaching America's elite soldiers how to prepare for exactly these situations. The Iron Wolves thought they were dealing with a frightened farmer, fortifying his property. They were about to learn why Cooper's Special Forces students had called him the Professor of Pain. Greater than, they began arriving in ones and twos, looking exactly like what their covers suggested: family friends visiting for the harvest season. A retired accountant in a sensible sedan, a contractor's truck loaded with building supplies, a couple in an RV who'd decided to stop by on their cross-country trip. Cooper greeted each arrival with the warm hospitality expected of a farmer hosting old friends. But these weren't ordinary visitors. Each one had trained under him at Fort Bragg, and each brought specialized skills honed through years of Special Forces operations. Dave Coleman, the accountant, introduced himself to Torres, class of '09. Torres grinned, recognizing the name. "You're the one who rigged that entire training compound with surveillance in under 4 hours." "5 hours now," Dave replied modestly. "Getting old." But he was already unpacking state-of-the-art monitoring equipment disguised in his ordinary luggage. The contractor, Mike Rodriguez, had been Cooper's top student in demolitions and structural engineering. His truck carried legitimate building supplies, but also contained enough technical gear to wire the entire property for tactical communications. "Remember that exercise in Colombia?" Mike asked as they unloaded his truck. "Where you made us build a command center that looked like a maintenance shed," Cooper nodded. "Same principle here. Everything serves two purposes. Everything looks normal to outside observers." The couple in the RV, Sarah and James Wilson, were actually former Delta Force operators who'd specialized in close protection and counter-surveillance. Their recreational vehicle was a mobile command center that would have impressed most military units. "Getting the band back together, Farmer?" Sarah asked, using his old nickname from training days. "Just having some friends over for the harvest," Cooper replied loudly, noting movement on the ridge where the Iron Wolves maintained their observation post. Then, quieter. "How's our watchdog situation?" "2 teams rotating every 6 hours, Sarah reported. "Amateur hour. They're using the same positions repeatedly, developing patterns." By evening, Cooper's farm hosted 6 former Special Forces operators, each appearing to be nothing more than friends helping with harvest preparations. But his tactical capabilities had expanded exponentially. In the workshop, now serving as their primary command center, Cooper briefed his team. "They're watching us host a reunion," he explained. "Let them think we're just socializing. Meanwhile, we're establishing a full tactical operations center." Dave had already upgraded their surveillance systems. Mike was designing sustainable defensive positions disguised as agricultural installations. The Wilsons were mapping the gang's observation patterns, identifying weaknesses in their security protocols. "They're getting sloppy," James reported, studying thermal imaging feeds. "Overconfident. Ghost is the only one maintaining proper tactical discipline." "He knows something's wrong," Cooper noted. "He recognizes the signs, even if he can't prove anything. That makes him dangerous." The team worked through the evening, each person falling naturally into roles they'd learned under Cooper's instruction years ago. To anyone watching, they appeared to be enjoying a casual dinner among friends. In reality, they were conducting a detailed tactical briefing. "Remember Rule 1 from training?" Cooper asked as they reviewed their preparations. "The best operation is the one the enemy never realizes happened," they replied in unison, grinning at the familiar maxim. As night fell, Cooper's guests settled into their assigned positions. Dave's surveillance network provided coverage of every approach. The Wilsons established counter-surveillance positions that would detect any attempt at nighttime reconnaissance. Mike's security systems were armed but completely invisible to casual observation. "Just like old times," Torres commented, watching the team work with practiced efficiency. "Except usually you were grading us on this stuff." Cooper smiled slightly, but his eyes were serious as he watched the Iron Wolves' observation team being relieved on the ridge. "The grade matters more this time," he said quietly. "We're not just protecting ourselves. We're protecting an entire community." His students, now hardened veterans themselves, nodded in understanding. Cooper had taught them more than just tactical operations. He'd taught them about responsibility, about using their skills to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The Iron Wolves thought they were watching a farmer host a reunion of old friends. Instead, they were witnessing the assembly of a team that had trained under one of the military's most effective instructors, a team that was about to teach them why Special Forces operators were called quiet professionals. Greater than. Cooper's barn had always been more than it appeared, but over the next 24 hours, it underwent a transformation that would have impressed military command centers. The key was making sure it still looked exactly like a working barn from the outside. "Layers," Cooper instructed as his team worked. "Everything has to serve both its cover purpose and its tactical function." He was in full instructor mode now, falling naturally back into the role he'd held for 20 years. Mike Rodriguez directed the technical installation, hiding sophisticated equipment behind weathered barnwood. "Just like that command post we built in Honduras," he commented, concealing a communications array inside what appeared to be old farm machinery. Dave Coleman had turned the hayloft into a surveillance center, his monitoring equipment camouflaged among bales and farm tools. From this elevation, they had perfect coverage of the valley approaches. "Multiple redundant systems," Cooper approved, checking the installations. "Remember what I taught about backup plans?" "The backup plan isn't Plan B, it's an alternate Plan A," the team quoted in unison, another lesson drilled into them during training. The Wilsons worked on the ground floor, establishing a tactical planning area that could transform into a regular barn interior in seconds. Tables folded into walls, screens disappeared behind hay bales, and communications gear tucked into what looked like tool storage. "Getting flashbacks to that exercise in Georgia," Sarah said, testing a concealed weapons cache, "where you made us build a full operations center that had to pass inspection as a storage shed." "Same principles," Cooper agreed, "except this time we're not just passing inspection, we're fooling trained observers." Torres coordinated the external security, ensuring that every new installation had a legitimate agricultural purpose. Cameras looked like weather monitors. Motion sensors were disguised as irrigation controls. Even the defensive positions were hidden within normal farm features. "They're still watching," he reported, noting movement on their surveillance feeds. "Two-man team on the ridge. Ghost is with them this time." Cooper nodded, unsurprised. "He knows something's happening. He just can't prove what." He studied their work with a critical eye. "That's why everything has to withstand professional scrutiny." The team had learned their lessons well. Every addition to the barn was carefully considered, every modification tested for both function and concealment. They worked with the quiet efficiency Cooper had drilled into them, each person knowing their role without need for discussion. By evening, the barn had become a fully operational command center while maintaining its appearance as a working agricultural building. Cooper gathered his team for a final inspection, moving through the space with the same attention to detail he'd used when evaluating training exercises. "Communications?" he asked. Encrypted channels established, Dave reported. Multiple frequencies, all looking like standard farm equipment signals. Even if they intercept something, it'll read like irrigation data. Surveillance? Full coverage of all approaches, Sarah confirmed. Thermal, motion, and visual. Everything routed through systems that appear agricultural. We can track movement anywhere in the valley without betraying our capabilities. Defensive positions? Integrated with existing farm features, Mike answered. Every firing position looks like normal equipment or storage. Quick access, multiple escape routes, all concealed. Cooper nodded approval. The barn now rivaled military installations he'd seen worldwide, but maintained perfect cover as a working farm building. Even Ghost, with his Delta Force training, would have trouble spotting anything amiss. "Remember what I taught about the best tactical position?" Cooper asked, surveying their work. "The one the enemy never realizes exists," his team responded, another lesson from their training days. As night fell, they activated their systems under cover of darkness. From the outside, the barn looked exactly as it had that morning, perhaps a bit tidier, as you'd expect, with friends helping for harvest. But inside, it had become the nerve center of an operation that would make most military units envious. Just like teaching advanced tactical ops, Cooper mused, watching his team conduct their final checks. Except this time, the test is real. The Iron Wolves thought they were watching a farmer clean his barn with help from visiting friends. Instead, they were witnessing the establishment of a command center that would coordinate their destruction. They just didn't know it yet. Greater than. The meeting in Tom Reynolds's hardware store looked like nothing more than local business owners discussing the upcoming Harvest Festival. To anyone watching through the storefront windows, including the Iron Wolves observers across the street, it was perfectly innocent. In reality, Cooper was conducting the same kind of community assessment he'd taught Special Forces teams to perform in conflict zones. He'd chosen the hardware store carefully. Its layout provided clear sight lines of all approaches while appearing completely natural. 7 combat veterans in town, Cooper noted, reviewing the information they'd gathered. 4 from Iraq, 2 from Afghanistan, 1 Force Recon Marine who served in both. He looked at Tom, plus you. The hardware store owner shifted uncomfortably. "Haven't thought about my service days in years. Just a supply sergeant." "Supply sergeants understand logistics," Cooper replied, using the same tone he'd used to build confidence in nervous trainees. "And the Iron Wolves' supply lines are going to become very important." Sheriff Thompson was present, one of the few officials Cooper had brought into their confidence. The law enforcement veteran understood exactly what they were building. "Got 3 deputies with military background," Thompson added. "Good men, solid training. They're tired of watching these thugs terrorize their hometown." Cooper nodded, marking positions on a map of the valley that looked like a harvest planning document. Every notation had dual meaning: delivery routes that could become patrol paths, storage locations that could serve as safe houses. "Mary Chen's daughter is State Police Tactical Unit," Sarah Wilson noted. She'd spent the morning quietly identifying potential allies while appearing to shop local businesses. 2 more veterans running the feed store, former Army Rangers. "Community's got more resources than it realizes," Cooper observed. It was another lesson he'd taught his students. Every population had hidden strengths if you knew how to identify and organize them. They worked methodically, mapping out capabilities while maintaining their cover as a business meeting. Each person there had a legitimate reason to be present. Each document could withstand casual inspection. "Key is coordination without visibility," Cooper explained, teaching just as he had at Fort Bragg. "Every action has to look normal to outside observers. Regular deliveries become supply runs. Social visits cover tactical meetings." Mike Rodriguez had spent the morning installing communications equipment that looked like ordinary business electronics. "Encrypted channels hidden in normal commercial frequencies," he reported. "They'll think it's just inventory management systems." The local veterans caught on quickly. Military training never really went away. It just waited to be reactivated. Cooper watched them begin thinking tactically again, seeing their town through strategic eyes. "Gas station gives us eyes on the main road," one former Marine offered. "I fuel their bikes myself 3 times a week. Could log their patterns, fuel consumption, estimate their operational range." "Feed store supplies their compound," another veteran added. "We see their delivery schedules, volume of purchases, could tell you exactly how many people they're supporting." Cooper nodded approval. They were thinking like operators again, seeing intelligence opportunities in everyday interactions. It was exactly what he'd taught his Special Forces students, how to gather information while appearing to conduct normal business. "Remember," he cautioned, "we're not building a militia. We're creating a network. Information and coordination are our weapons, not force." It was another lesson from his teaching days. The most effective resistance often never fired a shot. As the meeting concluded, participants left individually, spacing their departures to avoid attention. To anyone watching, it looked like a normal business day winding down. "Just like that insurgency exercise in the Philippines," Torres commented later, reviewing their progress, "where you taught us that the strongest resistance network is the one that looks like it doesn't exist." Cooper studied their updated community map, now marked with dozens of potential assets, each one perfectly legitimate on the surface, each capable of supporting their operation. "The Iron Wolves think they control this valley because they control the streets," he said quietly. "They don't understand that real control isn't about visible power. It's about invisible strength." His impromptu students were learning quickly, adapting their military experience to civilian defense. The gang thought they were watching a community cowering in fear. Instead, they were watching it transform into a coordinated resistance network, hidden in plain sight. Just as Cooper had taught Special Forces teams worldwide, sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the one you can see. It's the one you never realize is there until it's too late. Greater than, Ghost found Butcher in the Iron Wolves Command Center reviewing surveillance photos of Cooper's farm. The gang leader's frustration was evident in the scattered papers and empty whiskey bottle on his desk. "Something's wrong," Ghost said without preamble. "That farmer's not what he seems." "You're getting paranoid," Butcher growled, but his eyes kept returning to the photos. "He's just an old man with some friends helping for harvest." "Those aren't just friends." Ghost laid out his own observations. "Watch how they move, how they position themselves. They've got military training, high-level stuff, and their equipment installations." "They're putting up grain silos and fixing fences," Butcher interrupted. "You're seeing threats in shadows." But doubt had crept into the gang leader's voice. Other members were noticing changes too. Their intimidation tactics weren't working as expected. The community's fear was being replaced by something else, something organized. In Cooper's command center, Dave's surveillance systems picked up every word of the argument. "Dissension in the ranks," he reported. "Ghost's instincts are fighting with his loyalty." Cooper nodded, watching the thermal images of gang members moving through their compound. Their patterns had changed, more nervous energy, less disciplined coordination. "They're starting to second-guess themselves," he observed. "Just like that psychological operations exercise I used to run. Remember how it worked?" Torres grinned. "Where you made us doubt everything we thought we knew? Yeah, that was nasty. Half the class failed because they couldn't tell what was real anymore." Back at the Iron Wolves compound, more cracks were showing. 3 members had quit in the past week, claiming family emergencies. Others were questioning the escalating violence, especially after Thunder's killing. "The cartel's asking questions, Snake," their logistics officer reported nervously. "They don't like attention, say we're being too visible, too aggressive." "We're establishing dominance," Butcher snapped, but his confidence was wavering. Everything had seemed simpler before Cooper's resistance. Now each move they made felt like it was being watched, analyzed, turned against them. Ghost paced the command center, his special forces training, screaming warnings he couldn't quite articulate. Think about it. Every time we make a move, it's like they're ready, like they know our playbook. Because they're scared, Butcher slammed his fist on the desk. They're just farmers and shopkeepers. No, Ghost said quietly. That's what they want us to think. But look at their responses. The community's organizing, but we can't find their meetings. Communications are happening, but we can't intercept them. It's professional counterintelligence. Cooper's team monitored the growing discord with satisfaction. Each doubt they planted, each friction point they created, weakened the gang's cohesion. Their tactical discipline is breaking down, Sarah reported, watching through high-powered optics. Guard rotations are sloppy. Patrol patterns are becoming erratic. Fear does that, Cooper noted. Not fear of violence, fear of the unknown, not knowing who your enemy is, where they'll strike, what they know about you. It was another lesson he'd taught his students. Psychological pressure could break an enemy faster than direct confrontation. The Iron Wolves' problems were multiplying. Local businesses were finding creative ways to delay their supplies without appearing to resist. Equipment mysteriously malfunctioned. Small things, nothing that could be proven as sabotage, but enough to create constant friction. We need to hit them hard, Butcher insisted during another leadership meeting. Show them who's in charge. That's exactly what they want, Ghost countered. They're baiting us, trying to make us reactive. This isn't random resistance. It's a coordinated campaign. The argument ended in a standoff, but the damage was done. Seeds of doubt had been planted among the gang's leadership, trust was eroding, and their once solid control was beginning to fracture. In Cooper's barn, the team monitored the growing chaos with professional detachment. Just like you taught us, Torres observed, the strongest enemy can be defeated by turning their own strength against them. Cooper watched the thermal images of gang members arguing, their body language showing increasing tension. The Iron Wolves thought they were facing simple rural resistance. Instead, they were being systematically dismantled by psychological operations techniques he'd spent decades teaching to America's elite warriors. "Remember the cardinal rule of psychological warfare?" he asked his team. "The enemy's greatest. Weakness is their belief in their own strength," they replied in unison, another lesson learned in countless training exercises. The Iron Wolves were about to learn that lesson the hard way. Greater than. The operation began with something as simple as a weather forecast. Local news predicted heavy rain, and Cooper's team used the cover of incoming storm clouds to set their plan in motion. Just like that night exercise in Panama, Cooper told his team during the final briefing, weather isn't an obstacle, it's an asset. He'd taught this lesson countless times. Nature provided better cover than anything man-made. Mike Rodriguez had spent 3 days setting up what appeared to be lightning rods around the valley. In reality, they were part of a sophisticated electronic warfare system, disguised as ordinary farm equipment. "Grids in place," he reported, "looking like standard storm protection to anyone watching. Even Ghost won't spot the difference." The Iron Wolves had scheduled a major drug shipment that night, counting on the storm to provide cover. They didn't realize they were playing directly into Cooper's strategy. "Remember what I taught about turning enemy plans against them?" Cooper asked, watching his surveillance feeds. "They think the storm helps them. Instead, it's helping us." At precisely 11:47 p.m., as rain began falling in sheets, the operation commenced. Dave activated their electronic warfare system, carefully calibrated to affect only specific frequencies, the ones the Iron Wolves used for coordination. "Communications blackout confirmed," Dave reported. "Their radios are down, but civilian channels are unaffected. Looks like storm interference to anyone checking." The gang's convoy, 3 trucks carrying product and 4 escort vehicles, was already en route from their compound. Without radio contact, they couldn't coordinate their movements. exactly as Cooper had planned. Phase 2, he ordered. Sarah and James Wilson, positioned at strategic points along the route, activated powerful lights mounted on farm equipment. In the heavy rain, the sudden illumination created disorienting patterns. Another lesson from Cooper's teaching days: confusion was often more effective than direct confrontation. The convoy scattered, escorts losing sight of the transport vehicles in the artificial glare and heavy rain. Cooper watched through thermal imaging as their disciplined formation dissolved into chaos. Like watching one of your training exercises, Torres observed, when you disorient students until they forgot their basic procedures. State police vehicles, quietly pre-positioned on side roads, suddenly appeared with lights flashing. They weren't there to make arrests, just to add to the confusion, make their presence known. The Iron Wolves drivers, already disoriented and unable to communicate, were forced to take evasive action. "They're splitting up," Dave reported, tracking thermal signatures, each vehicle taking a different escape route. No coordination, no plan. Cooper nodded in satisfaction. The gang's training worked against them now. In the absence of communications, each team fell back on their escape and evade protocols, exactly as he'd predicted. The transport trucks, carrying valuable product, were forced to abandon their planned route. One ended up stuck in a drainage ditch that had been subtly modified the day before. Another found itself boxed in by broken-down farm vehicles on a narrow road. The third successfully evaded, directly into the path of a routine state police roadblock. "Status?" Cooper asked as the operation reached its climax. "2 shipments lost," Sarah reported. "1 seized by police, 1 abandoned in the ditch. Third escaped, but had to dump their cargo to avoid inspection. No direct confrontation, no injuries, no proof of our involvement." By the time the storm cleared, the Iron Wolves had lost an entire shipment without a single shot being fired. More importantly, they had no way to prove it was anything but bad luck and poor planning. "Their cartel contacts won't be happy," Torres noted. "That's a lot of product lost." More importantly, Cooper added, they lost confidence. Their own people will start questioning their leadership. It was another lesson from his teaching days. Sometimes the psychological impact of an operation mattered more than the physical results. In the Iron Wolves compound, Ghost stared at the after-action reports, his military training telling him what his gang loyalies didn't want to accept. This wasn't random misfortune. Every problem they'd encountered had been carefully orchestrated, but in ways that left no evidence of interference. "Weather interference with communications," he muttered. "Disorienting lights from farm equipment, police patrols happening to be in the right place. Too many coincidences." Cooper watched the gang's confusion through his surveillance feeds, remembering another lesson he'd taught. The perfect operation is one where the enemy never realizes they were in a fight until they've already lost. The Iron Wolves had just received their first real lesson in sophisticated tactical operations. They just didn't know who their teacher was yet. Greater than. Butcher's response to the failed shipment was exactly what Cooper had predicted: escalation. Within 48 hours, a dozen new motorcycles roared into the Iron Wolves compound, followed by 3 black SUVs carrying what were clearly professional mercenaries. "Right on schedule," Cooper observed from their command center. "Hit their pride and their pocket, and they always overreact." Dave's surveillance captured clear images of the newcomers. "Getting facial recognition hits," he reported. "Former private military contractors, Blackwater alumni, some with Delta Force washout records, guys who couldn't make the cut but still think they're operators." Cooper studied their movements through high-powered optics. The mercenaries moved with professional precision, but their very presence revealed the gang's desperation. "They're burning through their cartel funding," Torres noted. "Professional muscle doesn't come cheap." More importantly, Cooper added, They're bringing in outsiders who don't know the territory, don't understand the situation, just like that exercise in Morocco where reinforcements actually weakened the unit's effectiveness. Ghost watched the new arrivals with growing unease. The mercenaries were setting up their own command structure, establishing protocols that clashed with the gang's existing operations. Already friction was developing between the original members and the newcomers. "We need their expertise," Butcher insisted during a tense leadership meeting. "Someone in this valley is running professional-level operations against us. These men know how to counter that." "Or they'll make us an easier target," Ghost argued. "More moving parts, more potential failure points. Whoever hit our shipment knows what they're doing. Adding muscle doesn't solve our intelligence problem." Cooper's team monitored the debate through their surveillance network. The mercenaries were reorganizing the compound security, implementing standard procedures that looked impressive, but actually made their movements more predictable. "They're trying to turn a guerrilla operation into a conventional force," Cooper explained to his team. "Making the same mistake I used to fail students for, forgetting that strength can become weakness when misapplied." Sarah Wilson tracked the new patrol patterns the mercenaries established. "They're setting up textbook security protocols, the same ones we're trained to exploit." The tension in the Iron Wolves compound grew as the mercenaries began asserting their authority. They criticized the gang's amateur security measures, insisted on military-style protocols, and treated the original members like untrained civilians. "Your men are undisciplined," the mercenary leader, a hard-faced man called Kane, told Butcher. "No proper perimeter control, no professional communications protocols. It's amateur hour." Cooper watched the power struggle develop with satisfaction. Every change the mercenaries implemented made the gang's operations more rigid, more predictable, and ultimately more vulnerable. "Remember that lesson about overwhelming force?" he asked Torres, who was logging the new security patterns. "About how adding strength in the wrong way actually creates weakness. The more complex the machine, the more parts can fail," Torres quoted from their training days. The mercenaries installed sophisticated security systems, not realizing they were playing into the hands of Cooper's team. Mike Rodriguez had already found ways to tap into their frequencies, using their own professional equipment against them. "They're so focused on looking capable," Cooper observed, "they're forgetting the basic principles of asymmetric warfare." It was a mistake he'd seen countless times in training, operators becoming so focused on procedure that they lost sight of strategy. By nightfall, the Iron Wolves compound had been transformed. Guards in tactical gear manned professional observation posts. Military-grade communications equipment coordinated strict patrol schedules. Everything looked more professional, more intimidating, and everything was exactly what Cooper had hoped for. "They're trying to fight the last war," he told his team during their evening briefing, "setting up to defend against direct assault, not realizing that's never been our strategy." The mercenaries' presence had achieved something Cooper's psychological operations hadn't managed directly. It had created natural division within the gang's ranks. Old members resented the newcomers' authority. Trust was eroding. Unity was fracturing. "Just like you taught us," Torres said. "Sometimes the enemy's response to pressure does more damage than the pressure itself." Cooper watched thermal images of the compounds, increased activity, seeing not strength but vulnerability in every professional change they made. The Iron Wolves thought they were fortifying their position. Instead, they were building their own cage, constructing exactly the kind of rigid, predictable operation that Cooper had spent years teaching Special Forces teams to dismantle. Greater than. Cooper gathered his team before dawn, the Barnes Command Center illuminated by surveillance screens showing the Iron Wolves' new patrol patterns. The mercenaries' presence had made the gang predictable, and predictability was something Cooper had spent decades teaching his students to exploit. "Remember the isolation exercise at Fort Bragg?" he asked, marking key points on their tactical map. "How to separate an enemy from their support structure without them realizing it's happening?" "Death by 1,000 cuts," Torres nodded. "No single action big enough to trigger a response, but together they paralyze operations." The team had spent days identifying the gang's vital connections, supply lines, communication channels, local contacts. Now, with the mercenaries forcing everything into rigid military protocols, those connections had become vulnerable. "First target," Cooper indicated a local mechanic who maintained the gang's vehicles. "He's been cooperating out of fear. Show him he has alternatives." Sarah Wilson had already made contact, posing as a customer. "His daughter needs expensive medical treatment," she reported. "That's why he's helping them. I've arranged for her to receive charitable assistance from a veterans organization." "Second target," Cooper continued, "their fuel supply. The mercenaries insist on topping off vehicles after every patrol, makes their consumption predictable." Mike Rodriguez grinned. "Amazing how unreliable fuel quality gets when storage tanks aren't maintained properly. Nothing obvious, just enough contamination to cause occasional problems." The team moved with precise coordination, each action carefully timed to appear random and unconnected. Dave's surveillance tracked the gang's growing frustration as their operations began encountering mysterious difficulties. "Their communications equipment keeps losing calibration," he reported. "Amazing how sensitive professional gear can be to environmental factors." Cooper watched the Iron Wolves compound through thermal imaging. The mercenaries' response to each problem was to implement more rigid protocols, more detailed procedures, exactly as he'd predicted. "They're trying to solve tactical problems with technical solutions," he observed, "forgetting what I always taught about the human element being both the strongest and weakest link." The gang's local informants began experiencing strange luck. Those who provided information found their legitimate businesses suffering mysterious setbacks. Those who resisted found unexpected opportunities and support. "Just like that psychological operation in Thailand," Torres commented. "Changing the cost-benefit calculation without the target realizing it's deliberate." Ghost was the first to notice the pattern, but even his Delta Force training couldn't pinpoint the source. Every incident appeared random, justified, and completely natural. Equipment failures had documentation. Business setbacks had clear causes. Even their communications problems came with plausible technical explanations. "Something's wrong," he insisted during a security briefing. "We're being isolated, cut off from support." "You're being paranoid," Kane, the mercenary leader, dismissed. "These are normal operational issues. We just need tighter procedures, better equipment." Cooper's team monitored the growing tension between the professional mercenaries and the gang's original leadership. Every solution the mercenaries proposed actually made the situation worse, more rigid, more vulnerable to manipulation. "They're following the playbook perfectly," Cooper noted, responding to uncertainty with increased control, never realizing that control makes them predictable. By sunset, the Iron Wolves had lost 3 local informants, found their fuel supplies mysteriously contaminated, and spent hours troubleshooting communications equipment that worked perfectly during testing but failed during operations. "Remember what I taught about the difference between tactical and strategic thinking?" Cooper asked during the evening briefing. "They're solving each problem individually, not seeing the larger pattern." The mercenaries responded by implementing even more stringent protocols, more equipment checks, more detailed procedures, more rigid schedules. Each new measure created more points of failure for Cooper's team to exploit. "They're building their own cage," Torres observed, watching the thermal feeds. "Just like you taught us, when the enemy thinks control equals strength, they become their own worst enemy." Cooper studied their tactical map, now marked with dozens of small victories. none significant enough to trigger a major response, but together they were steadily dismantling the Iron Wolves' ability to operate effectively. Next phase, he announced. Time to let them see just enough of the pattern to make them doubt everything, but prove nothing. The gang had brought in professional muscle expecting a conventional fight. Instead, they were facing the kind of sophisticated psychological operation Cooper had spent decades teaching America's elite forces to conduct. They were about to learn why military precision could become a critical weakness when used without strategic understanding. Greater than. The message came through an innocuous delivery of feed supplies to the Iron Wolves compound. Snake needs his vitamin C. To most of Cooper's team, it meant nothing, but Cooper immediately recognized the emergency contact protocol he'd designed for deep cover operations 15 years ago. "We've got a friend inside," he told Torres, already moving to the communication center. "One of my old students has been in there the whole time." Dave Coleman quickly established a secure channel disguised as routine agricultural data transmissions. The response came within minutes. Agent Lisa Chen, FBI deep cover operative and one of Cooper's most gifted students in advanced infiltration techniques. "Should have known you'd be involved, Farmer," her message read. "Recognized your handiwork in recent events. We need to talk. Stakes just got higher." Cooper had taught Lisa everything she knew about maintaining cover in hostile territory. She'd been his star pupil in psychological warfare, capable of building trust while gathering intelligence. Now she was embedded in the Iron Wolves operation, posing as their communications specialist. "They're planning something big," her coded message continued. "Kane's mercenaries aren't just for show. Butcher's ordered a major offensive. Simultaneous attacks on multiple targets in the valley. They're done playing nice." Through their secure channel, Lisa provided details. The Iron Wolves had been embarrassed by recent setbacks. The cartel was pressuring them for results. Kane had convinced Butcher that overwhelming force was the only solution. 24 targets, Cooper read from the decoded message. Police station, key businesses, community leaders' homes. They're planning to hit everything at once, break the valley's spirit in a single night. Torres studied the target list. This is military-style shock and awe. They're going to try to paralyze the community with synchronized violence. Cooper's mind was already racing through scenarios, applying lessons he'd taught about countering coordinated attacks. "When's their timeline?" 3 days, Lisa's message revealed. "Kane's bringing in more contractors. They're mobilizing everything they have, but—" She paused, clearly weighing her next words carefully. "Ghost suspects something. He's been asking questions about recent accidents, getting too close to connecting dots." "Can you maintain cover?" Cooper asked, knowing how dangerous discovery would be. "For now, but we need to move fast. Ghost has Delta Force training. He sees patterns others miss, and Kane's people are professionals. They'll eventually figure out these aren't random setbacks." The team gathered in the Barnes Command Center, analyzing the intelligence. The target list revealed both the gang's capabilities and their desperation. They were committing everything to this operation, gambling that overwhelming force would crush any resistance. Classic mistake, Cooper noted, remembering training exercises where students had made similar errors. They think shock and awe works against an prepared opponent who understands asymmetric warfare. Lisa's next message added urgency. Butchers lost control. Kane's mercenaries are calling the shots now. They're bringing in heavy weapons, professional combat gear. This isn't going to be a gang operation. It's going to be a military-style assault. Cooper studied their tactical map, now marked with the planned attack points. The Iron Wolves thought they were preparing an overwhelming show of force. In reality, they were creating exactly the kind of rigid, coordinated operation he'd spent years teaching special forces teams to dismantle. "Remember what I taught about the vulnerability of synchronized operations?" he asked his team. "The more moving parts, the more points of failure," they finished in unison, another lesson from their training days. Lisa's final message was brief but clear. "They're doing practice runs tonight, full dress rehearsal tomorrow. You've got 72 hours before they go hot." The Iron Wolves were about to launch their biggest operation yet, committing all their resources to a coordinated valley-wide attack. They thought overwhelming force would guarantee victory. Instead, they were about to learn why Cooper's students called him the master of the indirect approach. "Time to show them why Special Forces operators don't rely on shock and awe," he told his team, already formulating counter-strategies. "They want to coordinate 24 simultaneous attacks? Let's give them 24 simultaneous failures." The gang was betting everything on this operation. They didn't realize they were playing directly into the hands of a man who'd spent 20 years teaching America's elite soldiers how to turn coordinated attacks into coordinated disasters. Greater than. Lisa's intelligence proved perfect. The weapon shipment was due to arrive at midnight via 3 unmarked trucks, using back roads to avoid attention. Cooper had other plans for their delivery. "Remember that interdiction exercise in Colombia?" he asked his team during the final briefing. "How to divert a convoy without engaging it directly." "Make them choose a different route," Torres recalled. "Then make them think the diversion was their idea." The team had spent 12 hours preparing, using the valley's geography exactly as Cooper had taught in countless training sessions. Mike Rodriguez had strategically placed roadwork signs on their primary route. Dave's surveillance network tracked their approach from 50 miles out. "First truck just passed checkpoint Alpha," Dave reported. "Right on schedule. They're running dark, no lights." Cooper nodded, watching thermal images of the convoy. 3 heavy trucks, 4 escort vehicles, all moving with professional precision. Kane's mercenaries were running security, which made them predictable. "They'll follow standard convoy protocols," Cooper noted, "which means when they hit our first diversion." The lead vehicle encountered emergency vehicles blocking the road, actually local veterans in borrowed maintenance trucks, complete with official-looking paperwork about a collapsed culvert. The convoy commander, following security procedures, chose the obvious alternate route. "Just like you taught us," Sarah Wilson observed from her observation post. "Give them a choice between your route and no route." The alternate road led them exactly where Cooper wanted, a narrow valley passage with limited visibility and no easy turnaround points, perfect terrain for the next phase of the operation. "Now," Cooper ordered. Suddenly, powerful lights blazed from concealed positions, illuminating the convoy from multiple angles. Simultaneously, the sound of helicopter rotors filled the valley, a recording Cooper had used in training exercises, but perfectly convincing in the confined space. "Law enforcement," boomed an authoritative voice through hidden speakers. "This is a federal checkpoint. Stop your vehicles and prepare for inspection." The convoy commander had seconds to make a decision. His thermal imaging showed multiple heat signatures in defensive positions. The helicopter sound suggested air support, and his training told him that in unfamiliar terrain, under uncertain circumstances, with valuable cargo, there was only one choice. "They're dumping the cargo," Dave reported, watching through thermal imaging as the truck's crews frantically unloaded crates into the brush. "Escort vehicles are scattering." Cooper allowed himself a small smile. The gang would find no weapons when they came back to search. His team had already arranged for their quiet removal through pre-positioned local volunteers. By morning, the entire shipment would be secured in federal evidence lockers, courtesy of his law enforcement contacts. "Classic misdirection," he told his team. "They thought they were making the smart tactical choice. Never realized the checkpoint wasn't real." The federal agents quickly vanished, local veterans returning to their normal lives. The lights went dark. The helicopter sound faded. By the time real law enforcement responded to reports of suspicious activity, they found only empty trucks abandoned by a crew that couldn't risk inspection. "Kane's going to be furious," Torres noted, monitoring the gang's communications. That shipment cost them most of their remaining cartel funding. In the Iron Wolves compound, the reaction was exactly what Cooper had predicted. Kane blamed the convoy commander for panicking. The commander insisted he'd followed proper procedures. Ghost argued they'd been expertly manipulated, and Butcher watched his planned show of force crumble before it began. Their entire tactical plan depended on these weapons, Cooper explained during the after-action briefing. Without them, they'll have to delay their coordinated attack, and delay means time for more things to go wrong, his team finished, remembering their training lessons. Lisa's encrypted message arrived an hour later. Compound in chaos, Kane and Butcher blaming each other, Ghost trying to convince them they're being systematically targeted. They don't know whether to accelerate their timeline or postpone. Cooper studied their tactical map, updated to show the night's events. The Iron Wolves had lost more than weapons. They'd lost confidence in their ability to operate securely. Every security procedure had worked exactly as designed, and that had been their undoing. "Remember what I taught about the perfect operation?" he asked his team. "The one where the enemy follows their training perfectly," Torres replied, "and that's exactly what defeats them." The gang's weapons had been captured without a shot fired. Their professional security protocols turned against them. They were about to learn another hard lesson about the difference between tactical training and strategic thinking. Greater than. The change began at Miller's Market, when 3 Iron Wolves members swaggered in demanding their usual protection payment. Sarah Miller didn't reach for her cash register. Instead, she looked them straight in the eye and said 2 words that changed everything: "Not today." Cooper watched through the store's security feeds, newly installed, but looking like standard equipment. His network had spent weeks preparing for this moment, building the community's confidence through small victories while maintaining their invisible support. "Look around," Sarah continued, her voice steady. Other customers, local veterans Cooper had carefully positioned, turned to face the gang members, not threatening, just present and aware. The gang members found themselves suddenly uncertain, their usual intimidation tactics meeting unexpected resistance. "You're making a mistake," one growled, but his voice lacked conviction. "No," Sarah replied. "You made the mistake. This is our town." The gang members retreated, trying to maintain their tough image, but clearly rattled. Within an hour, similar scenes played out across Pine Valley. Tom Reynolds at the hardware store, Mary Chen at the bakery. One by one, businesses quietly but firmly refused to pay. "They're following the pattern exactly," Cooper told his team, monitoring the gang's reactions. "Bullies don't know how to handle coordinated resistance." The Iron Wolves' response was predictable. They sent Kane's mercenaries to make examples of the defiant businesses. But everywhere they went, they found unexpected obstacles, traffic delays, equipment malfunctions, and always local veterans casually present, watching. "Just like you taught us about community defense," Torres observed. "It's not about confrontation. It's about making them feel exposed, uncertain." Ghost recognized the strategy first. "This isn't random," he argued during an emergency gang meeting. "The whole town's turned against us overnight. That doesn't just happen." But Kane dismissed his concerns, advocating for overwhelming force. "We go in hard, make examples, show them what happens to people who resist." Cooper's surveillance captured their planning session. The gang was falling into the exact trap he'd set, responding to resistance with brute force, never realizing that every act of intimidation now strengthened the community's resolve rather than weakening it. "Remember what I taught about the psychology of resistance?" he asked his team. "Once people stop being afraid, intimidation becomes counterproductive." The Iron Wolves sent teams to vandalize resistant businesses, but found their actions mysteriously failing. Paint wouldn't stick to treated surfaces. Security cameras caught every attempt, and always community members were watching, recording, documenting. "They don't understand what's happening," Lisa's encrypted message reported from inside the compound. "Their usual tactics aren't working, but they don't know why. Kane wants to escalate to violence, but Ghost is warning them it feels like a trap." Cooper watched the gang's frustration mount through their body language, their increasingly erratic responses. They were trained for direct confrontation, not the sophisticated resistance network he'd helped the community build. By sunset, the Iron Wolves had failed to reassert control over a single business. Worse, their failed attempts had only encouraged more resistance. The valley's quiet strength, carefully nurtured through weeks of preparation, was finally showing itself. "Like watching one of your training scenarios," Torres said, reviewing the day's events. "The enemy following predictable responses, never realizing they're being led into a strategic trap." In the gang's compound, divisions deepened. Kane's mercenaries demanded immediate violent response. Ghost argued for tactical withdrawal and reassessment. Butcher watched his authority crumble as his organization fractured under pressure. "They'll try something big now," Cooper warned his team. "Wounded pride and frustrated violence are a dangerous combination." But the community was ready. Cooper's network had prepared them for this moment, building their confidence through carefully orchestrated small victories. The Iron Wolves thought they were facing simple rural rebellion. Instead, they were experiencing the kind of sophisticated resistance strategy Cooper had spent years teaching Special Forces teams to implement. "Remember the most important lesson about community defense?" he asked during the evening briefing. "The strongest resistance isn't the one that fights hardest," his team quoted, "but the one that makes fighting itself ineffective." The Iron Wolves were about to learn that lesson the hard way, the quiet farming valley. They'd thought would be an easy target had become something else entirely, a community prepared to stand together, backed by tactical expertise they never saw but felt in every failed attempt at intimidation. Greater than. The Iron Wolves attacked at midnight, exactly as Lisa had warned they would. Cooper sat calmly in his darkened farmhouse, watching their approach through sophisticated thermal imaging. Kane had committed everything: 30 bikes, 6 SUVs, and all his remaining mercenaries. "Just like that night exercise in Kentucky," Cooper commented to his team, "when I taught you how to make an enemy's superior numbers work against them." They watched the gang split into assault teams, following standard military protocols. Kane's mercenaries led each group, their movements precise and professional. They thought they were executing a textbook raid. Instead, they were walking into a carefully prepared trap. "They're following the exact approach routes we predicted," Torres reported from his observation post, "moving exactly how their training tells them to move." Cooper nodded, remembering countless training exercises where he'd taught students to see how predictability could become a fatal weakness. "Initiate countermeasures. Let's show them why military doctrine only works when you understand the principles behind it." The first assault team hit their initial surprise. The open ground they'd scouted earlier had become a maze of farming equipment, carefully positioned to channel their movement. Each alternate route led them exactly where Cooper wanted them. "Remember what I taught about defensive terrain?" he asked over their secure communications. "How to make the enemy choose their own trap?" The gang's night vision equipment suddenly became a liability as powerful lights activated at precise angles, creating disorienting patterns of shadow and glare. Their radio communications, operating on predictable military frequencies, found themselves jammed by interference from farm equipment. "Second team hitting the south approach," Dave reported, "right into the prepared kill zone." But there would be no killing tonight. Cooper had prepared something far more sophisticated. The team sprung their traps in sequence, each one non-lethal but devastatingly effective. Smoke from malfunctioning equipment reduced visibility. Hidden speakers played disorienting sounds. Every defensive measure designed to create confusion without causing injury. "They're losing tactical cohesion," Sarah reported. "Teams getting separated, losing contact with each other." Kane's voice crackled over their monitored communications, trying to restore order. But his professional protocols, so impressive during planning, fell apart under carefully engineered chaos. Each team found itself isolated, surrounded by unseen threats that never quite materialized into targets. Ghost recognized the danger first. "It's a trap," his voice cut through the confusion. "They're using our own tactics against us. Fall back and regroup." But retreat proved as difficult as advance. Every escape route led to more confusion, more carefully prepared obstacles. The Iron Wolves found themselves scattered across Cooper's property, their superior numbers and firepower rendered useless by terrain they couldn't navigate and threats they couldn't engage. "Just like I taught you," Cooper told his team, "the best defense isn't about fighting, it's about making fighting impossible." Lisa's voice came through their secure channel. "Butcher's losing it. Kane's professional image is cracking. Half their forces are separated and disoriented." Cooper watched through thermal imaging as the gang's assault dissolved into chaos. Mercenaries trained for direct combat found themselves unable to use their skills. Bikes got stuck in deliberately muddy ground. Vehicles found themselves boxed in by abandoned farm equipment. They came expecting a gunfight, Torres observed. Instead, they got a lesson in tactical humility. Dawn found the Iron Wolves in full retreat. Their carefully planned assault turned into a humiliating rout without a single shot fired. Kane's mercenaries, their professional reputation in tatters, began pulling out. The gang members who remained were shaken, their confidence broken by enemies they never saw. "Remember what I always taught about superior force?" Cooper asked during the after-action briefing. "It's only superior if you can bring it to bear effectively," his team replied. Another lesson from their training days. The Iron Wolves had launched their biggest operation, throwing everything they had at what they thought was a vulnerable target. Instead, they'd experienced the kind of sophisticated defensive operation Cooper had spent decades teaching America's elite soldiers to execute. As the sun rose over his untouched farm, Cooper watched the gang's scattered forces trying to regroup. They'd come expecting to crush an old farmer through overwhelming force. Instead, they'd learned why his Special Forces students had called him the architect of defeat. Greater than. The Iron Wolves compound erupted into chaos the morning after their failed assault. Cooper watched through surveillance as months of carefully planted discord finally bloomed into open conflict. Kane's mercenaries were packing their gear, their professional reputation shattered by the night's humiliation. "You promised us an easy target," Kane shouted at Butcher, his professional demeanor cracking. "Instead, we walked into a military-grade defensive operation. My men won't risk their careers on your amateur-hour leadership." Ghost stood apart, watching the confrontation with the analytical eye of a Delta Force operator. Cooper had counted on his military training to recognize the truth. They weren't just being defeated, they were being systematically dismantled. "It's been him all along," Ghost interrupted the argument. "The farmer, every setback, every failure, every coincidence. It's all been orchestrated. We're not fighting farmers, we're fighting someone who knows exactly how we think, how we operate." Lisa's encrypted messages provided live updates from inside. "Cartel representatives arrived 10 minutes ago. They're not happy about lost shipments and unwanted attention. Ghost's analysis is making them nervous." Cooper gathered his team in the Barnes Command Center, monitoring the gang's implosion through multiple feeds. Everything was proceeding exactly as he'd planned. The psychological pressure points he'd carefully cultivated over weeks, finally triggering a cascade of distrust and fear. "Remember what I taught about breaking an enemy's will to fight?" he asked his team. "It's not about violence. It's about making them doubt everything they thought they knew." The cartel representatives were demanding answers about lost shipments and failed operations. Kane's mercenaries were loading their gear, cutting their losses before their reputation suffered further damage. Original gang members were splitting into factions, some backing Butcher, others wanting to cut and run. "They're experiencing tactical paralysis," Torres observed. "Just like you taught us. When an enemy can't trust their own judgment, they lose the ability to make decisions." Ghost tried to maintain order, his military training pushing him to establish control. But Cooper had ensured there was no control to be had. Every attempt to restore discipline only revealed more evidence of their systematic manipulation. The supply problems, the communications failures, the community resistance, it's all connected, Ghost insisted. "We've been playing someone else's game from the start. Everything we've done has been predicted, countered, used against us." Through their surveillance, Cooper's team watched the gang's structure crumble. Butcher's authority, already weakened by recent failures, collapsed completely as more members realized the truth of Ghost's analysis. They weren't just being beaten, they were being schooled. "Like watching one of your training scenarios play out in real time," Sarah commented, "when students finally realize they've been outmaneuvered before they even started." Lisa's next message added fuel to the fire. "Cartel pulling their backing. Too many losses, too much attention. They're cutting the Iron Wolves loose." The news hit like a physical blow. Without cartel support, without professional muscle, without the fear they'd cultivated, the Iron Wolves were just another bunch of bikers playing at being soldiers. And now they knew it. "Remember the cardinal rule of psychological warfare?" Cooper asked, watching the gang's members begin to desert in groups. "The strongest enemy can be defeated without a fight if you make them defeat themselves," his team quoted back. Ghost was the last to leave, his military training allowing him to finally piece together the full scope of what had happened. Cooper watched him survey the compound one last time, seeing their operation through new eyes, understanding at last how thoroughly they'd been outmaneuvered by an opponent they never truly saw. "Just like I taught at Fort Bragg," Cooper told his team. "The perfect operation isn't about winning fights. It's about making the enemy realize fighting is pointless." The Iron Wolves were breaking apart not from external force, but from the internal pressure Cooper had carefully built over weeks of calculated actions. They hadn't been defeated by violence. They'd been undone by doubt, distrust, and the growing realization that they'd never really been in control. Their own training, their rigid protocols, their professional pride, everything they thought made them strong, had been turned against them by a master instructor they never knew they were facing. Greater than, the end came not with a battle, but with the precision of a well-planned operation. Cooper watched from his command center as federal and state law enforcement vehicles surrounded what remained of the Iron Wolves compound. Lisa had timed her evidence dump perfectly, enough documentation of criminal activities to justify a full tactical response. "Just like that final exercise I used to run," Cooper told his team. "When students learned that the best victory is one where the enemy has already lost before the first move is made." Butcher and his remaining loyalists found themselves caught in a perfect trap. Ghost and Kane were gone, taking most of their tactical expertise with them. The cartel had withdrawn support, and now law enforcement had everything they needed for multiple federal indictments. DEA teams moving in from the north, Torres reported, watching through their surveillance network, FBI from the south, state police blocking escape routes. Everything we documented over the past weeks is paying off. Cooper's team had provided law enforcement with detailed intelligence, shipping routes, financial records, surveillance footage. Every coincidence that had plagued the gang had been carefully documented, building an ironclad case. "Remember what I taught about the difference between winning a fight and winning a war?" Cooper asked, watching the operation unfold. "The fight ends when someone gives up," his team replied. The war ends when fighting becomes impossible. Inside the compound, Butcher faced his own bitter realization. Every attempt to resist had been anticipated and countered. Every show of force had been turned against them. And now, watching federal agents methodically secure the perimeter, he finally understood. They'd lost this war long before they knew they were fighting it. Final message from Lisa, Dave reported. She's maintaining cover through the raid. Her FBI handlers will arrest her with the others, then extract her quietly. Her evidence will be crucial in prosecution. Cooper nodded approval. His former student had played her role perfectly, helping to dismantle the gang from within while gathering everything needed to ensure their permanent removal. The raid itself was anticlimactic, with their forces scattered, their confidence broken, and their leadership in disarray. The remaining Iron Wolves offered token resistance at best. Many simply surrendered, having seen enough to know when a fight was truly lost. Like you always said, Torres observed, the best tactical operation is the one where the enemy's defeat is assured before it begins. Law enforcement found exactly what Cooper's team had prepared them to find: documented evidence of drug trafficking, extortion, and organized crime. Every piece of intelligence precisely where Lisa had said it would be. Every criminal enterprise exposed and documented. Butcher, watching his empire crumble, finally asked the question that had haunted him for weeks. Who were we really fighting? Cooper, monitoring through surveillance, allowed himself a small smile. The gang leader would never know that his organization had been dismantled by the same principles Cooper had spent decades teaching America's elite soldiers, that true victory comes not from overwhelming force, but from making force itself irrelevant. As federal agents led the last Iron Wolves members away, Cooper gathered his team for a final briefing. The operation had achieved everything they'd planned. The gang destroyed, the community freed, and not a single shot fired in direct confrontation. "Remember the most important lesson I taught at Fort Bragg?" he asked his former students. "The greatest victory isn't defeating your enemy," they responded in unison. "It's making them defeat themselves." The Iron Wolves had come to Pine Valley expecting to dominate through force and fear. Instead, they'd become an object lesson in Cooper's teaching methods: how sophisticated strategy, patient planning, and understanding of human nature could overcome any amount of brute force. As the sun set over the valley, the only signs of conflict were the law enforcement vehicles methodically processing the gang's compound. Cooper's farm looked exactly as it had months ago: peaceful, ordinary, giving no hint of the tactical operation that had been orchestrated from its barn, just the way he'd planned it. Greater than. A week after the raid, Pine Valley began returning to normal, but it was a different kind of normal. Cooper sat at his usual table in the diner, watching the community move with a new confidence. The fear that had gripped the town was gone, replaced by something stronger. "Remarkable how quickly things change," Sarah Miller said, refilling his coffee. Her voice carried none of its old tension. "Hard to believe just a few weeks ago we were all afraid to open our businesses." Cooper nodded, noting how the townspeople now moved with purpose, heads high, watching their surroundings not out of fear, but awareness. The lessons in community defense had taken root, creating something more lasting than just victory over the gang. The best defense isn't about fighting, he'd taught his students. It's about making the community too strong to be an attractive target. Local news covered the aftermath in detail. Federal authorities had seized millions in assets from the Iron Wolves operation. The cartel connection had led to arrests across 3 states. Kane's mercenary company was under investigation. But more importantly, Pine Valley had found its strength. "We're keeping the community watch program," Sheriff Thompson told Cooper during their morning briefing. "Your veterans taught us too many valuable lessons to let them go to waste." Tom Reynolds's hardware store had become an unofficial gathering point for local veterans, sharing their experiences and expertise with younger community members. The defensive network Cooper had built was evolving into something organic. Neighbors watching out for neighbors, communication systems maintaining quiet vigilance. Just like you taught us about sustainable security, Torres observed, the best defensive system is one the community maintains naturally. Lisa's FBI team had cleared out the last of the gang's assets from the McKinnon Ranch. The property would be auctioned, with proceeds going to community improvement. Already there was talk of turning it into a training center for rural law enforcement. Funny how things work out, Cooper mused, watching the valley return to its peaceful routine. They came here thinking they'd found an easy target. Instead, they found a community that just needed reminding of its own strength. Ghost's final words to his fellow gang members, captured on surveillance before he departed, proved prophetic. "We weren't fighting farmers. We were fighting someone who knew exactly how to turn our strength into weakness." Cooper's team began departing, returning to their regular lives. Each carried with them new lessons about community defense, about how the principles they'd learned in Special Forces training could protect civilian populations without resorting to violence. The Barnes Command Center was dismantled, returning to its agricultural purpose, but the knowledge remained in upgraded security systems that looked like normal equipment, in communication networks disguised as business operations, in a community that had learned to defend itself while appearing utterly normal. "Remember what I always said was the true measure of success?" Cooper asked Torres as they watched the last of the team depart. "Not just winning the current fight," Torres replied, "but preventing the next one from happening." Pine Valley would never again be an easy target for criminals. Not because it was heavily defended, but because it had learned Cooper's most important lesson. True security comes not from visible strength, but from quiet competence and community unity. Greater than. 1 month after the Iron Wolves' departure, Cooper stood before a different kind of class. The old McKinnon Ranch, now converted into a community center, hosted 24 local residents, business owners, farmers, and concerned citizens. They weren't Special Forces operators, but they shared the same dedication he'd seen in his military students. "Security isn't about having the most weapons or the toughest fighters," he explained, falling naturally into his instructor's role. "It's about making your community strong enough that trouble looks elsewhere." The training program had evolved naturally from the Valley's experience. Local veterans shared their expertise, teaching everything from situational awareness to communication protocols. But it went beyond just security. They were building community resilience. "Like you always taught us," Torres said, helping coordinate the program, "the strongest defense is the one that looks like normal daily life." Sheriff Thompson had integrated many of Cooper's lessons into his department's procedures. Deputies learned to spot patterns, to read situations before they became problems. The Valley's law enforcement didn't just respond to trouble, they prevented it. "We're not training them to be soldiers," Cooper reminded his volunteer instructors. "We're teaching them to be aware, prepared citizens who work together." The results were subtle, but significant. Business owners coordinated their security measures, sharing information through networks that looked like ordinary commerce. Farmers maintained watch over remote areas while going about their normal work. The Valley had become a community that could protect itself without looking protected. "Remember what you taught about sustainable security?" Torres asked, watching the community's transformation. "The best system is one that becomes part of daily life," Cooper nodded. "Not an extra burden, but a natural way of doing things." Local businesses thrived under the new approach. The Valley's reputation for being well-organized and trouble-free attracted legitimate investment. What the Iron Wolves had tried to take by force, the community now built through cooperation and quiet strength. Cooper's farm remained just that, a farm. But the lessons taught from his barn had spread throughout the valley, creating something more powerful than any gang, a community that understood its own strength. Greater than. The autumn morning found Cooper exactly where he'd been when the trouble started, on his front porch, enjoying the sunrise with a cup of coffee. Scout lay at his feet, both of them watching the valley wake up. But while the scene looked the same, everything had changed. The farm remained as unassuming as ever, giving no hint of the sophisticated operation it had hosted. His barn had returned to storing hay rather than housing tactical equipment. To casual observers, nothing about Cooper's property suggested anything but peaceful agricultural life. "Some things don't change," Torres said, stopping by on his way to help with the community training program. "Still the same quiet farmer who taught us to think beyond the obvious." Cooper smiled, remembering countless training sessions where he'd taught Special Forces operators to see beneath surface appearances. The Iron Wolves had made the same mistake his students sometimes did, assuming that quiet meant weak, that simple meant unsophisticated. The valley had learned those lessons well. Businesses thrived, their security measures invisible but effective. Farmers went about their work, maintaining awareness without showing it. The community had absorbed Cooper's most important teaching. True strength doesn't need to advertise itself. "Remember what I always said was the mark of a successful operation?" Cooper asked. "When things look exactly the same, but everything's different," Torres replied, quoting another lesson from their training days. A motorcycle rumbled past, not a gang member, but a local veteran participating in the valley's volunteer patrol network. The rider nodded respectfully to Cooper, acknowledging the quiet farmer who'd shown them all how to defend their home without losing its peace. Cooper sipped his coffee, watching the sun paint the mountains gold. The Iron Wolves had come looking for an easy target, and found instead a lesson in strategic thinking. They'd never known they were facing a master instructor, never realized they'd become part of a teaching exercise in community defense. The best victories, Cooper had always taught, are the ones that look like there was never a fight at all. Scout's ears perked up at approaching footsteps. Sarah Miller, bringing Cooper's usual breakfast order from the diner. The valley took care of its protector, though he'd never asked for recognition or reward. "Some of us figured it out, you know," she said, setting down the food. "What you really did here. How you taught us all to be strong without having to prove it." Cooper nodded, understanding that the lesson would continue. The valley hadn't just defeated one gang, it had learned how to prevent the next threat from ever taking root. His students weren't Special Forces operators anymore, but everyday people who'd learned to protect their community through wisdom rather than force. "The best teacher," he'd always said, "is the one whose students learn to teach themselves." As the morning sun rose fully over his peaceful farm, Cooper reflected on how life had come full circle. He'd spent 20 years teaching America's elite soldiers how to think strategically, how to win without fighting, how to turn opponents' strength against them. Now he'd used those same lessons to protect his home, to strengthen his community, to teach civilians the art of quiet resistance. The Iron Wolves had mistaken his peaceful farming life for weakness. Instead, they'd encountered the culmination of everything he'd spent his career teaching, that true power lies not in visible strength, but in the wisdom to make strength unnecessary. Scout stretched lazily in the morning sun, the picture of rural contentment. Cooper's farm looked exactly as it had before the trouble started, and that, he knew, was the greatest victory of all.